Hello, everybody. It is us once again, the Wandering Pilgrims, doing the Universalist show with Jason Pratt. Hello, my friend Jason Pratt. Say hello to our audience, Jason.
Good evening. Sorry, my evil laugh just probably is not appropriate here.
Yes, it's the Universalist show where all dogs go to heaven except those annoying little yippy ones that you just want to kick like a football. And even Fred Phelps, we were just talking before we started the broadcast. Man, I'm kind of rethinking universalism since he's died.
He gets into...
Oh, damn it.
Yeah, sorry. But now, some of the things we're going to be talking about on our show tonight might or might not possibly apply to him or to people like him.
Ooh, we're going to be talking about purgatory?
However, I am not, maybe, but I'm really going to be talking more like about attitudes and Jesus's attitudes to our attitudes and just what those attitudes are that maybe we should be rethinking.
See, this is why I need a real studio. This is where that Alien Ant Farm song, Attitude, should be coming on slowly. So, yeah, the attitudes. And I think you mentioned you wanted to talk about the Valley Ben Hinnom. Yeah,
going to talk a little bit about that. Not a lot tonight. That'll probably be next week, the Valley of Hinnom.
Cool.
Tonight, we're going for the sheep and the goats.
That's a good one.
And all the various things connected with that. But mostly we're going to be in GosMatt 25.
Yeah. Yeah. That's probably the number one text. And I personally think that a proper understanding of the rhetoric and the form of speech that Christ was using when he mentioned, you know, what we translate into hell, Gehenna, Valley Ben Hinnom, or Valley of Hinnom. I think that that's really key in the debate, but I think most ECTers would probably default to Matthew 25.
Yeah. Well, I mean, and there's important reasons for that. I mean, it looks really obvious, and it's the last thing more or less that Jesus said on the topic before the crucifixion. And, you know, it's pretty colorful, and it has a strong history in the history of dispute against Christian universalism. It has a very ancient history going back at least as far as St. Augustine, who applied an argument from it that's still applied today in regard to showing not only that there's a hopeless punishment, but specifically using that against the idea that all people will eventually be saved. So now what we discussed last week was primarily John 5, but then a bunch of other things that were in context with that too. And that is also occasionally brought in as a testimony, because it's talking about Jesus resurrecting people to judgment, those who do the evil things, those who are not honoring the Father and the Son. And I'm going to summarize that later, because even though I wanted to before I got to the sheep and the goats, I wanted to talk about what Jesus said the purpose was for judgment. And we did. We talked about that last week a lot.
Right.
But I don't want to, I could technically try to proceed by saying, okay, we've established this. Now let's keep that in mind and interpret everything else afterward along this line.
I found people tend to be more receptive when I say, well, let's just assume this for the time being.
Yeah, well, and that's, but what I would rather do is say, okay, we've talked about that. Let me go now and talk about the sheep and the goats and everything else attached to that, and talk about that on its own merits, on its own data, and looking at it. And then after we're through with that, which I promise will take a while, then we can come back and say, okay, now comparing that to what we went over last week, what are the connections? Oh, that's how they fit together, you know. So
yeah, I think a lot of people don't realize just how prone to proof texting we are, and how many assumptions go to things. And so, like, I hope people realize that what you're trying to do is to avoid that pinpoint. Well, this must mean universalism, or that must mean. It's a big picture. It all fits together.
Yeah, and I don't want to. I know there's so many. If I started with John 5:23 and 24, and just said, there, that shows you universalism is true. You believe the Bible, don't you? What are they going to say? They're going to say, all you did was you took a verse and, you know, okay, granted the verse kind of looks like that, maybe, but you got to read it in fun with all these other verses. And why would you read all these other verses and use that as the key and not maybe some other verses as the key to understanding this? So, they would say, even if I went to an extended contextual argument at John 5, which I did, and followed it all the way through John to the end, through chapter 17, they might still come back and say, well, yes, if you take 10 or 15 scriptures out of all the Bible, that have some thematic connection to one another, you might be able to argue X, but in fact, X turns out to be false. And you really should have been arguing something else. And so it's kind of a wider version of the proof text argument, or the proof text complaint.
And the last thing I wanted to point out, because a lot of times people don't realize this, Gehenna was only mentioned 4 times in the entire ministry of Christ. And I know it looks like it's more than that, but we got to remember it's repeated 3 times over in each of the Synoptic Gospels.
Right. Yeah, because those are parallel.
So really, I mean, where that is really just those few. And I think that the heart of it is where you're going today is Matthew 25. And I think that's
but Matthew 25 does not even once mention Gehenna.
Right. Isn't that interesting?
Yeah. Now, what does that mean? Absolutely nothing. It doesn't
Argument
matter.
from silence.
It doesn't matter that he doesn't actually use the word Gehenna there anywhere, or Hades for that matter, or Sheol, or anything else like that.
Right, he's obviously talking about a final judgment.
Yeah, he's obviously talking about. Well, okay, I say he's obviously talking about a final judgment. I'll have to discuss that some, because it is not terribly obvious to some people that he's talking about final judgment. As weird as that may sound to a lot of people out there, there are in fact quite a few people, including some very high-level biblical scholars, like N.T. Wright, if I remember correctly, who say what you're looking at the tail end of Matthew 25 there, and the things leading up to it, and its parallels in GosMatt, which is called the Little Apocalypse, isn't at all about final judgment. It's only about the fall of Jerusalem in 70 AD, or 70 CE, if you want to call it the Christian era.
I suppose I could see that, but I mean, they're talking about the coming of the Son of Man. I mean, this is kind of...
Well, okay, what he argued, I'm just pulling him out of the top of my head because I remember some of his stuff that he wrote. What he argues is that the relevant Greek verb there is not coming back exactly. It's more like arrival, when the Son of Man arrives. Arrives where? Well, in Daniel 12, he seems to be arriving in heaven to take his throne on the judgment seat, to take his seat on the judgment throne. So in that sense, it's not him arriving back on earth necessarily, okay? But I mean, as far as the verb goes, as far as the Greek verb goes, it doesn't necessarily mean that he's arriving where we think he's arriving. but that's why there's contextual arguments, and I'm going to discuss some of these things. I just want to make it clear, I'm not a full preterist. This is called preterism, the idea that all the judgment warnings in the Bible have already been fulfilled, that they already came to pass, usually having something to do with the fall of Jerusalem. And there are some reasons for thinking that.
Yeah, there's not many preterists left. They're mostly Calvinists from what I can see.
Maybe, yeah. Which is interesting to me, but part of the reason that they come into that is because when Jesus is answering when he's talking in what's reported in Matthew 25, he has been answering questions in regard to what signs are there going to be, when are these things going to come about, when the temple is going to be thrown down.
Yeah, okay. It was I can't remember. Is Matthew 25 isn't Matthew's telling of the Olivet Discourse, is it? Or yeah, it is.
No. Well, yeah. I mean, what do you mean by the Olivet Discourse? Yeah.
Well,
I mean,
there's that parallel passage in Luke where it says the signs of the coming of the Son of Man are going to be.
Yeah. But it's more precisely paralleled in Mark.
Yeah, and I think a lot of times that people don't realize in the Olivet Discourse that that there is a very obvious change between talking about the fall of Jerusalem and then the ultimate fulfillment in the distant future.
But there are obvious parallels too between the fall of Jerusalem and the coming final judgment.
Well, the thing is that people don't realize, and this is my firm conviction, and I can thank Chuck Missler, anyone who thinks that he's a heretic, go on with your bad self, I don't care. But he's no worse than Tim LaHaye. So I get this idea that oh geez, now I got.
Did you lose your train of thought?
I'm too amusing to myself.
You woke up just 30 minutes ago. That's okay.
Oh, you didn't have to tell the world that. Oh. Yeah, I like to blame Michelle for that. I took a nap and the alarm didn't go off. So hey, that's a good thing about having a woman.
The woman gave you a lamp and you ate it. Words to that effect.
Yes.
Okay, I guess we better get started. I am going to eventually summarize some of what we talked about last week, but I don't want to do that yet because I want to come into GosMatt 25 fresh. All right, without necessarily thinking in presuppositions for about what we were talking about last week on judgment. We will get back to it, but I'd rather just kind of, because a lot of people are just going to start at Matthew 25 or something like it.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so I might as well do the same thing to some extent.
Yeah,
okay.
Makes sense.
So, okay, we got and now you're going to see me looking over here to my notes. Every once in a while, I'll have a lot of notes. The judgment of the sheep, the judgment of the sheep and the goats from GosMatt 25, which is usually listed among the parables for what I think are good reasons, because Jesus tells it after he tells a bunch of other parables. So if it's okay, if it's cool with Jesus to list them among the parables, I guess it's cool for me or anybody else who wants to. It's one of the most famous and common texts throughout Christian history for supporting some kind of final hopeless punishment, whether by proponents of some variety of eternal conscious torment or by proponents of annihilationism. They both go for this. One line of Universalist reply has been to interpret this and other such judgment warnings preteristically, there's a long term for you, referring only to the coming fall of Jerusalem, which by our time has already happened. In fact, by the time a lot of the New Testament was written, it had already happened in some dating theories. Other dating theories, all of the New Testament was written before the fall of Jerusalem. And we're not going to get into that, but I just wanted to point out there are different theories about this. Now, not all preterists, to say the least, are universalists. So you can think that these judgment warnings have all been fulfilled and still think that some people are going to be hopelessly punished, hopelessly lost, or whatever. And so they would say that even if this is talking about the fall of Jerusalem or the aftermath of the fall of Jerusalem, that doesn't in any way necessarily imply that the results of the judgment are hopeful instead of hopeless. In order to do that, you'd have to combine preterism with an argument to Christian universalism from, let's say, for example, a common type of penal substitutionary atonement where Christ has paid all the sin. He's paid all the punishment. All the punishment that God's ever going to give, Christ took it. And so, of course, if that's true, there's no more punishment. But then Christian universalism is true of some kind. And then after that, then you can go to say, well, if that's the case, what are these punishment things for? Well, that's the fall of Jerusalem. It's not really final punishment. And then one part of my brain is going to sit there and go, if Jesus really bore all the punishments, why did there have to be a fall of Jerusalem? But then I'm not a preterist. So, and I don't want to misrepresent their arguments just because I'm not one of them. And I'm afraid I'm going to not be very fair to them. So,
right.
And largely we can kind of set that topic aside to some point, because for most of the meaning of what's happening in the parables in Matthew 25 and the parable from Matthew 24, which leads into it, it doesn't really matter when the judgment is happening. You can also have an interpretation along the line that this is not so much final judgment as how Jesus always judges good and bad people. Post-mortem, pre-death, after death, doesn't matter.
Yeah, that's a pretty big jump of context.
I know, but I'm just saying there are people who go that route. Okay, what matters in my opinion, as we'll see later, I think what matters here more is what kind of attitude is Jesus judging against, and we're going to be getting to that later. But anyway, so I lost my mouse. So anyway, I recognize some of Christ's prophecies were intended to be fulfilled by the fall of Jerusalem. I mean, he specifically says so, including earlier in this portion of GosMatt, plus the relevant parallel material in the Gospel of Mark and Gospel of Luke. And I myself am not a full preterist. So for me, this is not an issue. And I agree with most conservative Christians, and to be fair, preterists often are theologically conservative too, that this particular judgment refers to something still to happen in our future, and or as a general example of how Christ judges all souls at any time, including the souls of rebel angels, who, to put it mildly, were not slain in the fall of Jerusalem. So,
well, I don't know. There's some of them stories you get there.
Yeah, well, I have some stories, but not really. Not a lot. Not any stories that have a lot of credence to them.
Yeah, it's not like when you had that angel that slew like what 70,000 Assyrians.
Yeah, well, but the difference is that we never hear of anything happening like that during the fall of Jerusalem. It's not like anybody comes through and wipes out all of the Romans, and that's kind of a big point. But we'll get to that in a minute. Now, let's talk about annihilationism just for a minute here. Now, an annihilationist, someone who believes that annihilationists, just to recap a bit, and they'll call themselves conditional immortalists. Conditionalists. They'll call themselves conditionalists. The idea being that people are only immortal if they accept life from God, if they accept eternal life from God through Jesus Christ. And if they don't do that, then God just blots them out of existence. Poof. They don't continue suffering eternal conscious torment.
That's what they would see as the second death in the lake of fire.
It would be the second death in the lake of fire, right? Now, an annihilationist can look at this material and get an idea of annihilation. Maybe not from it exactly, but it works with it. It works with annihilation, sort of. But if they do, then they either have to take this as referring to the lake of fire judgment after the final general resurrection, which I primarily agree with, or if they're being preteristic about it, they can't use this as evidence of annihilation, because otherwise the situation described here occurs one way or the other before the general resurrection, meaning the unjust people are not in fact being annihilated as a result of this judgment. Or I guess the annihilationists could deny the resurrection of the wicked as well as the good, but I understand that's pretty rare among annihilationists. So anyway, for exegetical purposes, the question is, what do the narrative, thematic, and grammatic details of the parable add up to if we approach the data from a neutral standpoint without begging the question in favor of one or the other kind of soteriology, logic of salvation? The text here was solidly transmitted through the copies, by the way, with only irrelevant grammatic or misprint differences that don't really matter for our purposes. Okay, so now we're looking, if you're in your Bible, you'll be looking at chapter 25, about 2/3 of the way through. Okay, Christ is gathering all the nations together when he comes with his angels to sit on the throne of his glory. And notice that despite calling himself the Son of Man, again here, Jesus is putting himself in the place of the one and only Jehovah Elohim Most High, as in Deuteronomy 33:2, and especially in Zechariah 14:5, where Jehovah comes personally to rescue the rebels in Jerusalem in the final assault against them after the pagan armies have actually already taken half the city and treated its inhabitants terribly where they were caught, which, again, to put it mildly, did not even remotely happen at the actual fall of Jerusalem. I mean, the Romans took the city and treated everybody terribly, but Jehovah didn't come and save them. Nor did those who escaped before the siege flee the city during the siege by means of a valley created by the mighty earthquake of the descent of Jehovah to save the city, which Zechariah talks about. Nor was a peaceful earthly reign of Jehovah from Jerusalem established afterward. Still, as we shall see soon, Jesus has yet another scripture in mind concerning the Son of David, which he is topically combining here with Zach 14. Now, Christ separates the nations one from another, as a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. That means Christ is acting as the shepherd of the goats as well as of the sheep. The goats belong to him just like the sheep do, and are part of his flock. This is tacitly implied by the grammar, which does not distinguish between possession of the sheep and possession of the goats. The analogy is not that of a shepherd separating some goats which got mixed in with his sheep. This will be even more obvious when we get to that Old Testament prophecy that Jesus is echoing here. Moreover, the term usually translated sheep, which is probaton, does not exclusively mean sheep. It's a general term for any small herd animal, including goats. It's also almost always the term used in the New Testament where English translates as sheep. This means in most cases, we could just as easily be talking about the good goat herd herding his goats and going out after the 100th goat to save it. There is at least one ancient painting of Christ saving the 100th goat, for example. Sheep are admittedly more numerous than goats usually, whether altogether or in distinct flocks, but that doesn't mean the term exclusively means sheep. On the other hand, the word translated goat here, which is erephos, does mean goat, but it very specifically means baby goat. The same term is used in the parable of the prodigal son when the older son complains that his father never gave him and his friends a baby goat to eat.
So the more accurate translation would be kid.
Yeah, kid. Yeah. Of course, in English, we think of kid as like a child, a human child. You
Right.
never gave me a human child to eat. Well, that would be kind of awkward.
Well, they are Jews.
Yeah. Oh, bad.
I'm
really,
sorry.
really bad.
I'm
Boo.
sorry. If
Right.
you watch any Muslim programming, oh man, you should see how badly they portray Jews. But I
I
love
do
Jews,
too.
everyone. I love Jews. I'm just playing.
Yeah, yeah.
All right,
So
go ahead.
anyway, so well, we're talking about an animal the size of a chicken or maybe smaller. Okay. But it has really, really tender meat, you know, like a lamb. So if you're eating veal, then you're eating the lamb version of a baby goat. You're eating the lamb version of an erephos. Okay, now if Matthew, or whoever translated Matthew's gospel into Greek, or even Jesus originally in Aramaic or Greek, although he's probably not speaking Greek to his disciples here, went to the trouble of calling them baby goats, why haven't translators usually translated that? As we shall see, those baby goats do make an important difference as baby goats. It's not completely decisive. If someone wanted to argue that sometimes the term is used to mean grown-up goats, that's okay, although as we'll see in coming up to the Old Testament reference here, there is a reference to strong sheep and strong goats and to weak sheep and weak goats. So there is a distinction being involved even in the original prophecy that Christ is referencing here. But, okay, you know, if you want to say that they're not baby goats, I might possibly accept an argument from that. We'll see. It doesn't actually make a decisive difference later. But if they are baby goats, it means a lot more. And you'll see why here in a minute. If the goats are specifically baby goats, then the probotons, by contrast, are probably mature sheep, or maybe the mature herd in general, possibly even mature goats with no intention of referencing sheep at all. Either way, the difference must be the contrast in spiritual maturity. Now, is there any evidence in the parable itself that their maturity is being contrasted to the immaturity of the baby goats? Yes, there is a lot of it, actually. Christ sends the sheep, and we'll call them the sheep for ease of convenience, into Eonian Life, whatever that means, which we'll be discussing soon. And they're being sent there to enjoy the inheritance, which has been prepared for them from the generation of the world, with the praise that they are blessed by his Father and have served him very well. Now, this catches the sheep entirely by surprise, which is kind of important. They're asking, when did they ever serve Christ? Now, any Christian, especially one familiar with this judgment parable, ought to know the answer already. We already ought to be expecting to be serving Christ. These people were not expecting that. We certainly ought to have been expecting to have been serving Christ. But these people are therefore not formally Christian. They had no idea.
That kind of sounds like the Calormany soldier at the final battle in the Chronicles of Narnia.
Yeah, Emmett. This is exactly, this parable was exactly what C.S. Lewis had in mind, a couple of places in Romans too, where he was talking about Emmeth, the Calormene soldier in the final battle, who actually goes into it thinking Aslan is a demon. He
serving Tash, which was supposed to represent Allah or the devil. Yeah,
the devil, serving the devil, not really representing Allah exactly, but serving the devil.
You get the Calormany people were supposed to be representing the Moorish people in general.
Yeah, that's true. But the idea there was, but now the idea there was that they were serving, when they were doing evil things, regardless of who they thought they were serving Tash, and when they were doing good things, they were serving Aslan. Okay. So he's actually thinking in terms of, hi John, he's actually thinking in terms of these sheep who didn't know they were even serving Christ. They didn't know they were serving Aslan. They didn't know they were serving God. And so they're caught by surprise. And so they have to be, Jesus has to explain to them when they were serving him. He says, when these people, which he calls the righteous and just ones, were feeding the hungry and giving drink to the thirsty and inviting strangers in and clothing the naked and visiting the sick and visiting those in prison, to the extent they did this to one of these, one of the brothers of me, one of the least, you did it to me.
Okay, hold on just a second here.
Okay.
I'm a little slow because I'm still a little groggy, and I think I just put 2 and 2 together. Are you saying that the goats are Christians?
Oh, yes. Yes, I am.
All right, carry on, my friend, carry on.
Okay. And not only that, they're not only Christians. You have to ask, who are these brothers of Christ he is pointing to? Because the grammar in Greek is emphatic that Christ is indicating someone else there on the scene, someone who isn't the sheep to whom he's talking. Now, people have supposed it was the righteous angels, and they're on the scene. And sometimes they come in disguise, and so it's not impossible that the sheep might have been serving those people, the angels, in disguise. Or maybe the sheep were serving other people who were formerly Christian and so who aren't surprised by this judgment and asking when they ever served Jesus. Or maybe Jesus isn't directly indicating anyone after all. But the only other characters actually portrayed in the scene as being the least of anything on the scene are the baby goats, who are literally among the least of Christ's flock. So when he's saying that you did it to the least of these who are my brethren, he's actually talking about the baby goats. The baby goats are the least of his brethren. And we'll see in a minute here that when this gets reversed around, there's an important phrase missing. Okay, so the baby goats, on the other hand, literally on the other hand, the left hand, are sent as ones who have been already accursed by Christ. And they're sent into Eonian Colossus, whatever we decide from context that involves. But the context must also involve them being sent into the fire, the Eonian, which has been prepared for the devil and his angels. Although Christ doesn't say that this is something prepared even for the devil from the generation of the world. It might be implied. The fact he doesn't say it doesn't mean it's not implied, but he doesn't say it. So, now, this surprises the baby goats. They thought they had been serving Christ. When did they ever refuse to through serve? That's the Greek term they're used there. Completely and fully serve Christ. You don't use that term unless you think you've been serving Christ. Okay? So,
well, isn't going to church the way you serve Christ?
I know. Well, isn't being a good doctrinaire how you serve Christ?
Oh, yeah, because I'm a heretic, so I must be going to hell.
Look how much of this judgment has to do with doctrine. Nothing! Absolutely nothing!
Saved by grace.
Saved by grace. They did not earn their way in by doing doctrine. They did not earn their way in by... The sheep didn't earn their way in by doing good works. They were cooperating with what Jesus already was leading them to do. They weren't rebelling against him. I mean, they were still sinners and needed salvation, but they were more on his side than not. So Jesus fairly judges them. He says, yeah, y'all are good. Come on in. But they're not convincing him to bring them in. So, and the goats they're not being judged here for failing to convince Jesus. Okay? That's also important. But anyway, so when were they not thoroughly serving Christ? Serving him through to completion? Well, when they refused to feed, clothe, visit in prison, etc., even the least of these, to that extent, they did not do it to Christ. Now, notice, Jesus does not add here that the least of whomever he is indicating are brothers of his. The implication is that Jesus doesn't have to explain that these least over there are his brothers, but he did have to explain to the confused sheep that those least over there were his brothers. In other words, those over there are the baby goats. The story warns people who think they are followers of Christ that they themselves may be revealed to be the least of Christ's flock, and sent as the least of Christ's flock, even if they are his brothers in some important way, which Christ wants to emphasize, into Eonian Colossus, something which involves Eonian Fire, prepared for the devil and his angels, who, remember, are also typically regarded as rebellious servants of God. So this all fits together. The baby goats aren't being punished in a way that other rebellious servants of God are being punished. They're being punished the same way. It's not a different way.
And I would like to mention, just in passing, that the pre-Hellenistic Jewish mindset did not see Satan as even a personal entity, but even in that capacity, like in Job, it was still seen as a servant of God.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Almost like the prosecutor.
Yeah. at the time of the first century, a big theory in Judaism about Satan was that he was the evil impulse. He was kind of like a personification of evil things in us. But they also had a lot of theories to the effect that he was a rebel angel. There were just a lot of theories. So at any given time, you're going to have one greatest rebel against God, one strongest rebel against God, whoever that is, whatever that is.
You can call me Eric.
Oh, yeah, because, Paul says, I was the chief of sinners.
I knew you'd get that.
Yeah. And I stand as, Paul talking, but see, we're supposed to be saying the same thing too, as Christians. Paul says, and this is in Ephesians, and believe me, we're going to be getting to Ephesians a while later down the line because there's a lot of really interesting things there. But Paul says, I was the chief of sinners, and I stand here as a example of the gracious salvation of God to save even the worst of sinners, even the chief of sinners. Well, the chief of sinners is Satan. So he's standing kind of as an example for saving Satan. All right, but we'll get into that later. I don't want to get too far off on that. We're just sticking with this part right now. Okay. So, what I'm saying here is that we got the devil and his angels who are rebel servants of God, one way or the other. Okay. They're servants of God, chief servants of God, and they have rebelled, and they're fixing to be zorched with the Eonian Fire and Eonian Colossus. Same thing. And then we have these baby goats who are the least of Christ's flock. And they were surprised to learn that they were not thoroughly serving Christ after all, serving him through to completion. They're rebel servants of God, and now they're going to be zorched. But we're talking here as a contrast between these people over here who thought they were the first, and these people over here who probably went into the judgment thinking they were going to be the last. And even though Jesus doesn't use the phrase the first will be last and the last will be first, this is very much one of those judgments where the first will be last and the last will be first.
And I think he was very, very strongly implying that he was referring to the Pharisees.
I'm implying more than that. He was referring to the disciples and the apostles. He was warning them, just like he's warning us. Don't be bad servants. And we're going to be seeing a lot more of that coming up when I'm looking at these other things in GosMatt 25. Now, the Pharisees also count. I'm not saying they don't count. The evil Pharisees, the ones who are using their position to abuse other people and so forth. And if the shoe fits, they wear it. So, but I don't want people to get hung up on the idea of, oh yeah, he's talking about the Pharisees, those people over there. No, he's warning the people who think they're good Christians. And you may not, in fact, be thoroughly serving Christ the way you should. And those people over there, just like when he's talking to the Pharisees and saying, man, those pagans and traitors and prostitutes are getting into the kingdom of heaven ahead of you. Well,
how often we forget the judgment begins with the household of God.
Mm-hmm, exactly. Well, he's saying the same thing to fellow Christians here. Those people over there that you didn't think were going to be getting in, and they're surprised at getting in, you're going to be surprised they're getting in. C.S. Lewis used to say, there's going to be surprises, and he had this parable in mind specifically. And he agreed. I mean, his thing was the same way. It was like, obviously, he didn't think I don't recall him ever talking about the goats being baby goats, but he pretty clearly thought the goats were misbehaving Christians. So, all right. So we've got a reversal of expectation. It's another one of those parables. It fits very well with Jesus' warning that the last will be first and the first will be last. He doesn't use that phrase here, but it's the same sort of thing. And it's set up to test the audience, the people hearing it or reading it. Who is the audience? Well, originally the audience was Jesus' own chosen apostles and closest disciples. That's the scene that was set a couple of chapters back in GosMatt. They're being privately instructed by Jesus about what to expect from the end of the age, whatever that means. Now, today, the audience would naturally be anyone reading or hearing the text, or both. In antiquity, you read your text out loud. But especially anyone who regards ourselves as disciples of Christ, like those apostles and close disciples being originally addressed. And the test is this. How are we to regard the baby goats who are the least of Christ's flock? When we're sitting here and now we're thinking, okay, what's going to happen to those baby goats? They're going into the Eonian Fire. They're going into Eonian Colossus, whatever those things mean. So here we are, and we're supposed to be thinking, what's going to happen to them? So let's try out some hypotheses here. Should we deny that the baby goats shepherded by Christ are of Christ's flock at all? A lot of people do, but basically the parable is saying that they're part of the flock of Christ. And when I point that out, sometimes people will blow their minds. Never even occurred to them that they were part of the flock of Christ. But Jesus makes no distinction about whether they are or are not part of his flock.
Yeah, I imagine most people would just reject it a priori just because of the assumptions with which they walk into this passage.
Right. Surely Jesus is going to save all his flock. I agree. He's going to save all his flock. That means he's going to save those baby goats too. But we're, that's a different argument. We'll be getting to that later. So, but at least we shouldn't deny that the goats are part of the flock. They are part of the flock. And when we get to the Old Testament reference that Jesus is making here, we're going to see they're part of the flock. So, if the baby goats are made hungry now and thirsty and are made strangers outside and sick and naked and imprisoned, which is a list of things that show up a lot in the scriptures, Old Testament and New Testament, for when sinners are being punished by God. They're punished with this sort of thing. Are we to ignore them now? Is that what the mature flock does? Ignore those people who are the least of Christ's flock who are in that condition? Should we expect the good sheep and the good shepherd to start behaving like the baby goats toward the baby goats now? Or should we expect the good sheep and the good shepherd to continue behaving like good sheep and the good shepherd? Because we know what's going to happen, whether analogically or literally, to those baby goats, thanks to a bunch of other judgment details elsewhere in the scriptures, such as, for example, from the end of the Revelation to John, chapters 20 through 22. They're going to be hungry now and thirsty, and placed outside the gates of the New Jerusalem, and their clothes will be dirty, or they'll be naked, and they'll be cast into the lake of fire, along with the rebel angels, the fire Eonian prepared for the devil and his angels, as Jesus puts it here in Matthew 25. And they will be sick, at least in their mind, fondling their sins impenitently. So, what are the Son, who is Christ, and the Spirit, and the bride, who is the mature flock, what are they going to do in regard to the least of Christ's flock being punished by Christ like that? Will we, be treating those baby goats over there the way the sheep in this judgment would? Will we, for example, be going out to exhort those strangers outside the New Jerusalem to slake their thirst in the freely given water of life flowing out of the never-closed gates of the city, and to wash their robes so that they might obtain permission to come inside the city and eat the fruit of the log of life, which is the cross, the leaves of which are for the healing of the nations? Will the righteous continue to practice righteousness toward the least of Christ's flock, even so long as the least of Christ's flock continues to practice injustice and insist on being dirty? Or will the mature flock start acting like baby goats to the baby goats of Christ, who have themselves been condemned to Eonian Colossus in the Eonian Fire for acting like baby goats to the baby goats of Christ? But even if I didn't have the end of Rev John or other similar lists describing how God will punish evildoers by putting them into situations typical of the least of Christ's flock in this judgment, and I want to say here, completely aside from how I ought to interpret the end of Rev John there, which is something we'll be getting to a lot later, I would still know what to expect from the narrative and thematic logic of this judgment parable. I would expect consistently, coherently, I would expect the sheep and the shepherd to keep on acting toward the baby goats like the good sheep and the good shepherd. And I would expect that on pain of being found myself to be only a baby goat, accursed by Christ. Now, before I get to the main objection people have raised from this judgment to universal salvation, I'm going to take a pretty long detour, and it's not really a detour, but I want to look at the rest of GosMatt 25 and see how it fits together with this thing. Okay, and I also want to look at the parable that leads into chapter 25, which is, there's a set of 4 parables here, but in Bibles, eventually there was a chapter break after the first of the parables, and that starts chapter 25. But a lot of people don't realize that there is a 4th parable there. So let me back up one parable to the middle of chapter 25. This is GosMatt's version of the parable of the talents, which in Luke, in a somewhat different time, about a week earlier in the time frame, is also called the parable of the minas. And it's also part of this block of judgment parables that told to Jesus' own apostles and first disciples on the Mount of Olives the Wednesday night before he went to the cross. It's also a testimony, whether from here or in GosLuke's version, raised against universal salvation, and also turns out to have an expected meaning. Because there would be people, I've seen people, very reasonably, they'll point to this judgment, whether it's in Matthew or whether it's in Luke, either one, and say, look, that guy's being searched. He's hopelessly being damned and punished, maybe annihilated out of existence. Maybe not, who knows? The annihilationists would say he's being annihilated out of existence. The other people would say that he's being eternally put into eternal conscious torment of some kind. And so that's a testimony. But how do the details add up exactly? Let's take a look. All right. Who is the man in this parable who is punitively judged when Christ returns? And here it really doesn't matter what returns means. When Christ arrives, when he comes. I mean, you can say when he arrives, the other place that he's arriving in heaven, perhaps, if you want to go a preteristic interpretation, and that this is not talking about a second coming. But here, it's pretty blatantly talking about a return back to the people again, back to his own servants.
Yeah, especially, it's like Daddy's coming home. Y'all better watch yourselves.
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, all three of these preceding parables are about Christ coming back. He's not just arriving somewhere else. He's coming back. So, then I think that maybe the fourth parable about the sheep and the goats is also about Christ coming back. It's not just about Christ arriving somewhere else and then getting into the judgment. He's coming back. So, who is the man in the parable who is being judged, who is being punished in judgment by Christ when Christ returns? Well, you don't have to look very far in the details to figure out that he is a chosen servant of God, where God is equivalent to the king or the household or the nobleman in this parable. He's a chosen servant of God, even a slave of the household, actually distinguished from the enemies of Christ in the earlier version told by Jesus on the final road to Jerusalem. And you can find that in Luke 19, verses 12 through 27, if you want to put a finger there. He's given great authority, like the other chosen servants of God in this parable. To do what? Well, in ancient Near and Middle Eastern culture, he would be being chosen to do the family business. Now, and we're going to get into the question of what that family business is in a minute. This man refuses, despite being chosen from other slaves of the sort who have been adopted into the family, to do the family business while Christ is gone. What is the family business? Well, God's family business is not to make money by wisely investing money. That's a parable. That part's an analogy. No one really thinks that either. I mean, it's not like now people will sometimes try to draw an investment parable out of that, an investment moral.
I already made my one Jew joke of the night. I can't make it.
Yeah. We're just not going to go there. But if you want to do that, that's fine. But that's not real. He's not really talking about investing money here.
Right, of course not. It's about resources and about accomplishing the work of God.
But doing what with the resources? Okay, Jesus expects us, and Matthew reports at the very end of his gospel account, what does Jesus expect us to do? At the very last thing that Matthew reports at the end of his gospel, Jesus expects us to be leading people to repent of their sins and become loyal servants of Christ instead of continuing to rebel. This servant was supposed to be leading other people to be servants of his master and king. In the parable, this is it's analogized poetically by reference to investing the family's money, which again shows just how much authoritative trust the nobleman was giving to this slave who belonged to the nobleman's household. The problem, both here and in Luke's report of the parable, is not that the man was never part of the household family. He definitely was. In our relevant terms, he wasn't only a Christian, he was a Christian recognized by Christ as a real Christian and given authority to be representing Christ and doing the work of Christ. Nor is the problem that the man only has one coin to work with. In the previous version of the parable, every servant equally receives one coin. And the coin each of them receives is worth about 100 day wages. In other words, what a person could expect to earn as a payment for a day's work. So here, Jesus is specifically upgrading that amount, which is already ridiculously large by first century standards, to the amount called a talenton. Now, even one talenton would be the largest load of silver, the largest unit of silver. Okay, I mean, you could have multiple talentons and have a larger load, but that was the largest single unit of silver as a value at the time. Tens of thousands of day wages in one talaton. So this is an amount that's managed only by the most skillful and trustworthy stewards of the richest kings. So the problem isn't that he doesn't have money to work with. Even in Luke's version, he's got a lot of money. In Matthew's version, he's got exponentially, vastly much more money. Just with one. The problem is that the man doesn't want to do business with his talent or with his mina at all. And that business represents what? Leading sinners to accept God's salvation from sin and back into loyalty to God. The lazy servant could have done the absolute minimum along this line, supporting other people in evangelism like most of us do, represented in this parable by investing his talenton, or his mina in Jesus' earlier version, in the bank for his master to draw back with interest upon his return.
The word fire insurance jumps into mind.
Well, you see, this lazy servant, he's not ignorant. He's not a talentless nobody, because the king would not have given him this money to work with if he had been nobody who had no talent. No one gives 100 day wages. No one gives 10,000 day wages to somebody who manages, to someone who's sadly incompetent. You just don't do that. You don't even give it to somebody who is normally lazy. If we think in terms of our English word talent, which is derived from applying this term to anyone's personal abilities, since after all, only kings and their most trusted servants would have access to such ridiculously huge amounts of silver and gold, and it's something we should apply to everybody. This man was given rich talents for the job. He's got all the advantages, even all the Christian advantages anyone could reasonably ask for. But even an unexpected attack of mere laziness. Let's assume that he just, for some reason, a little neuron in his mind blows or whatever, and he decides, man, I just cannot deal with this. Even then, that turns out to not be the problem, because even the laziest person could simply invest the talent somewhere for interest, so to speak. So, that servant turns out to be like the baby goats in the final climactic parable. He didn't want to save sinners from sin. He didn't even want to save them from being merely punished by his master. How can we tell that he regarded any punishments by his master as hopelessly final? Because of how he tries to defend his refusal, both here and in Luke's version, which not incidentally happens to involve slaying rebels in Christ's presence at his return. So he says, I was afraid because I know you are an austeros man. That's how he answers in Luke's version. I know you are a scleros man, he answers in the Matthew report. Those terms mean much the same thing. They're synonyms. Tough, harsh, violent, furious. In modern English slang, he would be saying, I know how much of a hard ass you are.
Nice.
He's gangsta. If you went to the crudest gangster rap for descriptions of how dangerously criminal some badass is, you would still not be going beyond what this servant of God, chosen by God, is saying to God, about God, to excuse himself from leading sinners to repent and return to God.
That's hardcore, man.
Gangsta flattery even turns out to be literally correct.
Really?
Yeah. He continues, you pick up what you did not set down and you reap what you did not sow.
Hey, that's right. I saw that episode of Sopranos.
Yeah. The man isn't trying to insult his master, and I got this from Kenneth Bailey and some other people, because they understand what the Near Middle Eastern context is. He's trying to flatter his master in a typical way that's still used in the Near Middle East by comparing him to a tough, independent, ruthless, tyrannical bandit murderer. Yes, that's how they flattered people that way. A powerful supervillain, basically.
What a lovely culture.
We might say it's a supervillain. Back then, they had a special name for the devil, specifically along this line. They called him the plunder possessor, Beelzebul.
I always thought that meant the Lord of the Fly.
Well, it depends on how it's spelled in the translations. But the Aramaic is Beelzebul.
Mm-hmm.
There are other ways of spelling it which mean slightly different things, and that's all okay. But in the parable that, and we'll be getting to that a few weeks from now when we're doing the sin against the Holy Spirit, in the parable that Jesus is talking about, it's pretty clearly plunder possessor, because Jesus talks about how he's going to go in and tie up the strong man that's the bandit, the man who has the plunder, and plunder his plunder. So it is the plunder possessor. Okay, this guy in either of these two parables, he's excusing himself from trying to lead people out of their sins to Christ by saying that Jesus is a hard ass on the level of Satan, that he's a supervillain. This is somebody who
this is starting to get really clear to me.
Yeah?
Yeah. So you're saying that those people are the ones that teach that God's like the dictator in the sky. Those people who are the ones that teach eternal conscious torment and turn or burn and all that.
And their justification is God is such a badass. He's going to flatten you. Like,
Calvinist.
Like something like something from Warhammer 40,000, Yeah, I like Warhammer 40,000. It's really terribly bad theology. I wouldn't want to try to flatter Jesus like that.
Hollywood theology.
It's Hollywood theology, and Hollywood theology has been around a really long time. Now, I want to be as fair as possible to this cretin who's calling Jesus really terrible names here. He's not exactly wrong. I mean, in Jesus' earlier version, which is told to the crowd on the road up from Jericho, the new king orders those people who appealed to him against the emperor, which is probably a comparison to the rise of Herod Archelaus over Israel, who had afterward built an expensive palace near Jericho, and Jesus and the gods were probably walking by at that time, about a week earlier. He orders them to be brought before him and slain in his presence. So, yeah, he can be pretty violent when it comes to the punishment. But is that really the point? In both versions, this radically, insultingly, hatefully unevangelical servant of God is punished as harshly as he was expecting God to punish other people. That's a lot closer to the point. In the version here reported at GosMatt 25, which is told by Jesus privately to his own chosen greatest servants, including the apostles, and notice the connection there, on Olivet Hill, this worthless slave is cast into the outer darkness where the wailing is and the gnashing of teeth. In the version reported in Luke 19, he would have been judged for his own rebellion against the explicit orders and authority given to him by his master. Orders which, accounting for the accounting metaphor, would have involved leading enemies of his master to be friends, allies, and servants of his master, even coming to be part of his master's household, the way the servant himself was.
So he lost his salvation.
You could say that in some sense. And he would have been judged the way he was rightly enough expecting his master to judge the ones petitioning the emperor against him, to be among those slain in his master's presence. And Luke's version even has Jesus saying, "Out of your own mouth shall I judge you, you worthless slave." You want me? You're saying that I'm a hard ass, and that I do things that are violent and the worthless and punishment that's going to be hopeless. Well, let's see how you like some of that punishment. And he's being punished for having that attitude. The attitude he has is the attitude of not being merciful. He's expecting really bad punishment, and he's being punished for expecting really bad punishment, for insisting on it, not just expecting it, but in his heart, insisting on it, going so far as to rebel against God in order to try to get other people to be punished that way.
It's kind of reminiscent of the brother of the prodigal.
Yes, and of Jonah, the prophet.
Yep.
He was rebelling against God in order to keep God from saving those Ninevites because he wanted to see them fry.
I see a theme.
All right, keep in mind, because the cultural details in either version of the parable make this very clear, so I've made sure to emphasize, this is not someone like a pagan Norwegian in the 2nd century who's never heard of Christ at all. This is not a rabidly anti-Christian modern atheist or neo-pagan or Muslim misrepresenting the faith to lead people astray. This isn't even the Antichrist or Satan. This is, by analogy with the parables, a direct and explicit servant of Christ, called and richly empowered with high authority in either version, effectively one of God's own elect, and especially so in GosMatt's version, which is told specifically to the apostles and the other closest disciples. He is expected to work to lead back to God and out of their sins people whom this servant rightly expected to be punished by God for their sins. And his complaint, in effect, is that God can and should punish those people over there, hopelessly, rather than saving them from their sin. So the parable is a test to the Christian audience again. What should we, as evangelical servants of Christ, expect the fate of that evil, uncharitable, anti-evangelical servant of God to be? Because if we say, yes, annihilation for him, as some people particularly like to interpret the Lucan version, or yes, into the hopeless imprisoning torment with him, as some people particularly like to interpret the Matthew version, if we say either way, we put ourselves under the same judgment. We ourselves are revealed to be the anti-evangelical servant of God. You are the man, the prophet Nathan announced to King David after the king agreed in judgment against the evil king in Nathan's parable. The king shall surely destroy those murderers, the Pharisees had cried earlier that Wednesday afternoon when Jesus told a parable against them. When God, as Jesus or otherwise, is inspiring a judgment parable, we had better be very careful about how we agree with the outcome.
Do you have any idea how sweeping the implications are of what you're saying right now?
Oh, yeah. I have a lot of idea of how sweeping the implications were, and I have to tell you, that's how when I was looking into the scriptures, that was me. I was that guy.
That's what I'm saying, is everyone who's watching this show that calls himself by the name of Christ, they need to realize that if what you're saying is true, Jesus is pointing a finger right at them.
Yeah. And a lot of his parables are like that. A lot of them. It's a test for the listener, and it kind of tricks you.
And as a brief aside, I want to say that since I first began to see how certain texts just couldn't be made to say otherwise, how there's no other way I could possibly read it, no matter how hard I tried. Since I began seeing that, the progression that I began seeing more than anything, and this is a long journey for me, but it seems like it's on its head. Like, it turns our whole ecclesiology on its head. That that church is almost like preschool, and that the real servants are out there not concerned with that stupid stuff.
Yeah.
I mean, maybe that's my slight. I go a little far when I say that stupid stuff. I'm not saying the churches are stupid. What I'm saying is most of the stuff that we do at church is kind of ridiculous.
Well, it's training.
Yeah.
It's training union. That's what we used to call it in a Baptist church with the service at night. It's called training union. Well, it's training union. So, but then what are you training for? Well, you're training to go out and be good people, be a good representative of God to other people, and lead other people to God.
Isn't it funny how it's most of the people who sing "Onward, Christian Soldiers" that rarely go anywhere for the sake of Christ?
Yeah, but hey, listen, you don't have to go that far for the sake of Christ. The guy in this parable, he could have just invested what he had, and Jesus would have been okay with that. He says so. He's willing to accept even the minimum we're willing to do if we're doing it with a good heart. What he's not willing to accept is our bad hearts, the bad attitudes we have toward things and toward other people, especially an unsaving attitude toward other people.
You know, for all those people who say that God is, and I always get a kick out of it when people use this word because obviously they don't know what it means, but when they say that God is a megalomaniac, and because I just for everyone who's out there, it is impossible for God to be a megalomaniac. He is by definition God. Which,
yeah.
So
it's not like he can think any higher of him. It's not like he can think more highly of himself than he actually is.
Yeah, he's the one who has a right to have that, and he's not. People think he's some control freak, some dictator, and it seems to me, and of course, I really like Brad Jerzak. I disagree with his hermeneutic a lot. And I like Michael Hardin, but I disagree with his hermeneutic even more. Just looking at the Bible itself, it seems to me like God, all the glory and things like that he talks about of himself in the Old Testament, what does he always come back to? Serving the widow and the poor in their distress, the orphans. And,
what does God require of you? To walk humbly and do justice and not much.
I mean, hell, one of my favorite books of the Bible is Ecclesiastes, and what you find throughout that, the theme, it's not a very religious book.
It's very dark.
I know a lot of other people will see it as dark. I never did. I've battled depression throughout my life, so for me, this is kind of like my bread and butter. This is how I think, and it's like when he's going through it, it's like yes, this is meaningless. This is wearisome. It's chasing after the wind. Yet that's him affirming, like you said, with much knowledge comes sorrow. And he's affirming that yes, this stuff does suck, but check it out here. This is what God gives us. You can enjoy the work of your hands. You can enjoy the good things of life. And I get this real sense where he's saying you don't got to feel guilty for it. Drink your wine, eat your food, dance, have fun.
You're going to die tomorrow.
Yeah, he's not talking about licentiousness because, of course, that's where,
he's saying in moderation. He's saying in moderation.
And I think that's really revolutionary for Christianity in general, because we have these two extremes. You got the license, and then you got the legalism, and everyone tries to claim to be in the middle. But I think really the way to be balanced is to carry Christ. Like I know some people say that Francis of Assisi didn't say this. I think he did, where he says, "Wherever you go, preach Christ crucified, and use words only when necessary."
Yeah, if necessary, use words.
Yeah. I butcher quotes all the time. I'm okay with that.
Yeah. No, well, I'm almost sure it was not in English, so it doesn't really matter.
Hey, Paul butchered Old Testament quotes left and right, so I don't feel so bad.
Yeah, he was inspired. He can do that.
One quick question before you get back to your spiel. Okay. I never asked you this. The doctrine of Theonosos. Do you believe in infallibility, biblical infallibility?
That is a large question, and my oversimple answer to that is I believe God is inerrant and that God never fails in his purposes, and that what he does with the scriptures is not going to fail in his purposes either.
Yeah, it's a good answer.
Now, if you press me on inerrancy, then I'm probably going to say two things. The first thing I'm going to say is that I agree with all of pretty much everything affirmed by the Chicago Inerrancy Statement, including all of the qualifications that they have, which are a lot. And the second thing I'm going to say is I kind of feel like if you put all those qualifications in, maybe it's not such a good idea to call the result inerrancy anymore. It just kind of confuses things, because I've actually seen people lose their faith over this more than once. Where they have grown up hearing from preachers, here's the word, it's all true, or it's not at all true, boom, slam the Bible down.
Yeah, I just
100% true. You can trust everything in there, everything it says. Well, and then of course, when you actually start reading it, you have issues and you have things. You're like, well, okay, did Jesus heal that centurion's son before he did this or after he did this? Because the Gospels say, one of the Gospels says he did it before this time, and the other Gospels are pretty clear saying he did it afterward. Which one of those is true? Oh, well, now you have to take into account, it's important to take into account that the way that people wrote things back then, they didn't necessarily, as long as they got the themes right, they were okay about shuffling time scales around.
All right, and we're talking about largely, what's the word I'm looking for? Word of mouth?
And culture, oral tradition. You're talking
oral
about
tradition. Yeah, that's what I was talking about. Yeah.
Yeah, and there's a certain variance in amount of... all of these explanations, they're correct, and I accept them, but try to explain those things to somebody who has been told that you just better believe exactly what the Bible says right there,
right.
Their minds get blown.
It's
not the same thing.
Yeah, I didn't want to take us too far off topic and stuff. I just wanted to get that out of the way, because I probably should have.
Say anybody who has run into me talking about these things who is not a Christian, every single one of them believes that I'm inerrant.
Yeah, so, that's how you come across. To be honest.
Because the the scriptures are historically true, and I'm a harmonizationist. I put the scriptures together and figure out how to solve problems, because there are some kind of problems, but they're interesting solutions too. Little stereoscopical things sometimes where you have two things that look like they're kind of conflicting, but when you put them together, it's like a 3D picture pops out, which is really cool.
You're like a three-headed monster here,
Ghidorah.
because it's like normally the Reformed tradition tends to have the claim to the logical system. You know, they're the ones that have the most consistency, or at least seek the most consistency in harmonizing all aspects of Scripture in strict exegesis. And it's like, you've gone everywhere but there. You know, Arminian, then Universalist. It's like, what do you have against Calvin, bro?
I don't have any. Well, of course, I have against Calvin only the part that he thought that people were not going to be saved. That's pretty much it. I mean, think about it. If I start off as an Arminian and I become a Universalist, which is what happened, essentially what I'm doing is I'm accepting Calvinist gospel assurance.
Yeah.
That God is definitely going to be able to save those he intends to save from sin.
And Robert Rubio and I have discussed this an awful lot, that it almost seems like if you take universal salvation out of the equation, you're going to fall either Calvinist or Arminian, but you put it back in, and you put it back in, and it's like, boom, they're back united. Unless you want to be an open theist, but
yeah, it allows me to put together more of the scriptures than I was able to do before.
So what we have so far, you've established that the goats and the sheep, the goats are actually just the immature ones, the kids, and they're actually most likely Christians.
Yeah.
You've also established that the lazy servant, the slothful servant, was not only most likely a Christian, but a rather prestigious one.
Yeah, very much so. I mean, not someone specifically in mind. It's not like Jesus was talking about Judas Iscariot or St. Peter or whatever.
No, it sounds very clergy-ish.
Yeah. Okay, well, it is very clergy-ish, but please notice, that doesn't mean Jesus is against the clergy. There's more people in that parable than just the lazy servant. There's a bunch of them in Luke's in the version that Luke reports. For purposes of getting the point across, Jesus only talks about the first two and then gets to this guy. But there are more. In Matthew's version, he just kind of omits all the other people. He only has these three people. But there are more, and they're rewarded. They're faithful, and they get this job done. So if you're saying, well, yeah, Jesus was being anti-ecclesiastic, on these parables, no, he was not. What he was very much against was people abusing their authority and talents given to them by Christ.
And that is how I have always interpreted the word Nicolaitan.
Nicolaitan, right. Yeah, that's reasonable. That's very reasonable. We'll have to get to that a lot later. But yeah, because other people are not going to, what's Nicolaitan? Oh, that's from Rev John and a few other places.
Yeah, I mentioned twice. I know that one of them is in John's Revelation, and the other one, it's one of Paul's, I'm pretty sure.
Yeah, I can't remember exactly where.
Can't think of it off the top of my head, but it's just real briefly. I had it broken down to me that it was made two words, Nikeo and Laos. Laos, yeah. Nikeo being the overthrowers or conquerors, and Laos being common people.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Just seemed germane.
Yeah. Well, and that kind of leads to the question of what Nicodemus's name means. Because it's pretty clearly a nickname.
You know, and it's funny, it's not very often I mention Chuck Missler.
As I go pounding off into this other direction that has nothing to do with
that's okay. I'm gonna tie it back in. It's just funny because it's like twice tonight Chuck Missler has popped into my head, and I haven't listened to this dude in years. But he's one who really turned me on to the idea of how fractalated Scripture is. How it seems like it's that. Yeah, it's like one big fractal. Like you can see it, and it's almost like a hologram too, in that you can cut out large sections of the Bible. You might lose a little resolution, but the full picture's still there. Yeah. And you see these syllogisms. You see these even the puns used in Scripture. I mean, it's crazy. It's like not only is God a more genius playwright than Shakespeare, he's got a better sense of humor than Robin Williams. He's more warrior-like than Mad Max. He's more self-sacrificial than, I can't think of anyone. The first one that comes to
William
mind.
Wallace. Let's get another Mel
William
Gibson.
Wallace. Yes. God will have his genitals cut off for you. That's what William Wallace had done. They
eviscerated him. They pulled his guts out.
Michelle was walking by me. She's like, "What?" Sorry. Okay. So we're pretty much we're seeing a lot of our conventional ideas turned on its head with a very small adjustment in how we're reading Scripture. It's these tiny little adjustments that seem to me, from my vantage point. I mean, I've never studied Greek, so I'm taking your word on a lot of this stuff. But it seems to me like with just a little exploration that it's really right there, right in front of you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I'm not one of those people that to quote. I think it's Isaiah where God says you shouldn't call everything a conspiracy that these people are calling a conspiracy. I'm not one of those people that say, man, there's a conspiracy to translate the Bible in ways that get rid of universal salvation and other things like that. There's not. I really don't believe that there is.
And I agree with you there. I would just really hearken to ecclesiastical bias, though.
Yeah.
It's an inadvertent bias, but it is a bias.
Well, there's Protestant translators of the Bible too, but now some of them are big into the ecclesiology. But
yeah, and the thing is that people get to understand about interpretation, about translations. If you've ever studied a foreign language, it can really make sense. There's no direct translation, it's always shades of meaning, and this idea that I don't know. I think people expect too much of a translation. There's a level of interpretation involved with any translation.
Yeah, and you've kind of got to. You really have to sort of compare different translations and try to get an idea of how the different translation teams work.
Right, and I know there's a lot of people who are against commentaries. I purposefully look out. I look for commentaries that are divergent, that are very different, that say things that others don't say, because I want that largest variety of ideas. So.
This is the New American Standard here is. I use this a lot. And
that's my Bible. Yeah.
I love this because this particular Bible has got Strong's Concordance in it, and the Complete Concordance for the Greek, and I think all of it for the Hebrew too. And it'll mark the various words as to what they are and what their grammatic forms are. But it also has a commentary in it that's written by a pretty hardcore Calvinist, and I read that. I read the commentary too. I'll be going along reading the commentary, and I've learned things from it. I've learned things from reading him.
Have you checked out the ESV Study Bible?
No, I haven't checked out any of the English Study Version.
In my opinion, the ESV, it's the ESV Study Bible. It's not like, how every translation has its different study versions and stuff. Mm-hmm. Like, you get the Reformation Study Bible and the NASB. Well, the ESV, the company that makes ESV, put out their own specific study Bible, and it is the most comprehensive study Bible I have ever seen. The charts, the maps, the footnotes and explanations, the cultural notes and contextual things, the cross references, absolutely amazing.
I'll look into that then.
Yeah, definitely, because it seems very, very unbiased too. As I read the study notes and everything, it really seems scholarly, trying to approach it from a genuine desire to understand, not push an agenda. So definitely check that out.
One kind of doctrine or the other. Yeah.
You can get a regular hardcover for like $30 online. It's phenomenally cheap.
It's a lot easier to read physical Bibles for reference than to do Kindle sometimes, I think. Kindle's good for searching, but it's not real good for doing notes.
And the cool thing about the ESV Study Bible is if you buy it, you actually have online access to the same exact stuff as it's in the ESV. So the cool thing, and I'm going to let this go because I know you got a limited amount of time. You want to finish this. But the really cool thing about the ESV, I've always had a problem with the how they handle the copyrights for a lot of translations. It's really money-oriented, and the ESV has gone out of their way to make the text available in every possible way without any strings attached. And so I really believe in the guys who worked on the ESV. It's in the tradition of the King James, so you're going to be familiar with a lot of the phraseology there.
These and thous and that sort of thing.
No, it's not archaic at all. It's
okay.
It's well, you know how the NRSV kind of took a secular route?
Yeah, a little bit, yeah.
Yeah, well, the ESV is kind of
by standard.
Yeah, the ESV is kind of correcting that course from what I can see. It retains a lot of the phraseology of the King James, like not these and thous. The verbiage is all new. The vocabulary is all modern. It just uses a lot of the poetry that the King James version uses. You know how the words just float off your tongue. Great example is Psalm 23. You know. Yes, though I walk through the valley of shadow of death, I shall feel no evil, for your rod and your staff, they comfort me. It's like you can't really change that wording around because it's taken on a cultural...
Right. Well, the New American Standard is like that, too. It takes a lot of cues from the King James.
So, anyway, I'll let you get back to your thing.
Okay.
Now.
Well, let's get back to
basically, Jesus is saying Christians suck.
Yeah. Well, he's saying a certain kind of attitude in a Christian sucks. So... going back again to the sheep and the goats, let's go back now that we've looked at this guy. An interpretation that involves the good shepherd coming to hopelessly destroy part of his flock puts Christ himself in the place of the rebel or thief who in John 10:10 comes to steal, destroy, and even in the Greek of John 10, sacrifice part of the flock for his own salvation. Whereas Jesus teaches exactly the opposite. The good shepherd sacrifices himself for the flock. That's in John 10. You can read a lot about that. So, does that include those currently accursed by the good shepherd himself? Yes! If it didn't, none of us could ever be saved from our sins by God. God sends his Son to sacrifice himself for our sakes while we are yet sinners, of evil minds in rebellion against him, as Paul puts it. Now, no doubt someone will say that the parable of the foolish virgins, which starts Matthew 25, and which Christ tells ahead of the parable, where Jesus condemns to the Eonian Fire those chosen servants of his who foolishly refuse so hard to save sinners from sin that they regard his punishments as being hopeless, as from a monstrously evil supervillain who sacrifices others for himself. They're going to say that, this parable about the foolish virgin somehow counts as the hopeless punishment of these or those non-Christians instead of the punishment of people chosen by Christ to serve him in the coming of his bride. Which, if you can follow my ironic commentary there, you can see why I would say that's a foolish interpretation to make in context of the two parables following it. But so far as the details go, the punishment of the foolish servants of Christ in that parable, they don't seem to be so hopeful for the servants, so I might as well discuss it while I'm passing by it. To put it shortly, the parable involves a group of foolish servants of the bridegroom, or perhaps the foolish servants of the bridegroom's bride. About half the text support the idea that the bridegroom is going back to the bride's house to get her, and half the text suggests he's coming back to his own house with the bride. Either way, they would not be left outside forever. At worst.
What would be the implications if we're talking about servants of the bride?
I'll be getting a little bit into that here in a minute. It's kind of interesting. Well, it doesn't ultimately matter. It has minor differences involved in the implications because the servants of the bride are going to become the servants of the bridegroom anyway.
Yeah, I was just curious because, a lot of those little things seem to make big differences these days.
Sometimes they do, yeah. But fortunately, in this case, even though there's a lot of early text to the effect of one way and a lot of early and widespread text the other way, it doesn't really matter. It's kind of it's a textual critic puzzle that we like to kind of poke at and say, well, we'll never figure that out.
6 of one, one of the other.
Yeah, we can't figure out which one is original and which one was, whether the word was omitted or whether it was added. We could say from the details that since the bride is never mentioned again after the first time, that kind of makes it look like the bride was added at the very beginning. But that's kind of the one thing that sort of edges it over into the idea that the bride was added. But it doesn't really matter either way. So the reason I'm saying this is if you're looking at a Bible and you're like, well, it says he's coming with his bride, and somebody else may be looking at the Bible and says, it doesn't say he's coming with his bride. That's why. Okay? But it doesn't really matter. Either way, they're not going to be left outside forever. At worst, they would be picked up the next morning after the nuptial celebrations are done at the bridegroom's house, embarrassed about having been left outside and wiser for the experience. And if they are servants of the house of the bride, who will then become servants of the groom, they'll actually be picked up that very night. Once the wedding is done and the married couple are ready to make parade back to the bridegroom's house for the after party and the best of the celebrations on the wedding night. Moreover, as far as their language goes, I mean the foolish virgins, they are definitely not impenitent, just like the punished servants of Christ in the following two parables. They aren't even asking to be let in. They're demanding to be let in.
Oh yeah, they're all like flipping out because they're like, "Come on, this is all right."
Let me in. You let me in. Their master is certainly replying to their demand to open the door, despite them knowing to give him the double Lord, Lord, which is reserved in the scriptures for God Most High, Jehovah Adonai. He does say, "Truly I am saying I am not acquainted with you." But if he's bringing his bride back to his own home, that can't be literally true, or he wouldn't have chosen them to be an important part of the wedding party to welcome him back to his house.
I just wanted to say real quick, I never really thought of that, the Lord, Lord being like, Lord Yahweh.
Yeah. Yeah. Jesus
really
is
cool.
sneaking that in.
That's
now,
really cool.
Somebody could just say that for emphasis. Master, Master, let me in. Yeah, well,
I like yours better.
Now, on the other hand, later that night, if the other option is true and he's leaving with his bride to go home, the bride's going to clarify these are among his servants too. And either way, pressing the detail to say God, the omniscient, needs to be told by the church who is and who isn't a servant of the church, that's not exactly good theology. You can't really deny that God knows who these people are and just rip the heart out of supernaturalistic theism and trinitarian theism. So it's a figure of speech. But he's trying to make a point that these people who, in one version of the parable, they were chosen by him. These aren't just random women off the street who decided they want to be part of the party. They were servants of the household.
You could maybe even say they were elect.
Yeah, they were elected to be there and to keep the lights on to welcome him in. And they failed. And the other ones also fail. The wise virgins also fail. 100% fail. The difference is that they made preparations for failing beforehand just in case they failed. And the other ones didn't.
Yeah, stitch in time saves 9.
Yeah. But at least the foolish virgins are knocking on the door, even if they're being impenitent about it. They're seeking their own master one way or the other. They're not just giving up and going home. And if we read hopeless finality into their punishment, despite the cultural contexts, well, you could try to do that. If we deny that they should keep on knocking on that door, if we deny the door shall be opened eventually, sooner or later, to those who keep on knocking and seeking, what are we going to be doing?
And let's just remind people that most Bible translations really fail badly at that passage.
Yeah.
It's knock and it'll be open. No. Isn't it?
Knocking.
Yeah, isn't it the aorist tense?
Yeah. Keep on knocking, continually knocking.
Perfectly, like forever. Don't stop knocking until he answers. And I think that's highlighted when Jesus talks about that old lady that was wearing that judge down by constantly
going to him. Yeah. And that parable it's kind of funny because you can't quite tell in the Greek there, and either interpretation could be true. Either his eyes are black and blue because he's losing sleep over her constantly hammering on the door to bug him about this, or she has actually punched him in the eyes.
What?
Yes, that's a possible interpretation of the Greek in that parable. That the man, I may not fear God and I may not fear man, but I'm fixing to give this woman what she wants because she's blackening my eyes.
Dude, we've all known one of those chicks. We've all known one. Okay, she lives down the corner. Actually, we got one next door here.
What did Chris Rock say at the end of that video about how not to get your butt beaten by the police? Don't take a mad woman with you in the car, because she will say anything if you're pulled over.
Yeah.
And there is nothing she wants more than to see you get your butt beat by the police. All right, we're done off pretty far. I better not do that. Okay. All right. So anyway, if we deny that the virgins are going to be saved in the end, if we're insisting that they're going to be locked out of that house forever, well, we're putting ourselves in the place of the baby goats and the worthless servant again. By extension, we're putting ourselves in the place of the foolish virgins. All right, before I go back from here to the first of 4 judgment parables Jesus is telling in this sequence, starting at what we call the end of chapter 24, I want to spend a few minutes talking about the other parable. You may have even a long time ago remember me hearing this. The other parable from the Jewish scriptures that Jesus was referring with the sheep and the goats. For as we shall see, its topic also overlaps with the first of these four examples, with these four parables. Okay. Now, this other older parable is at Ezekiel 34. We talked a little bit about Zechariah 14, where Jesus is where the Lord God Almighty is coming with His angels to judge various people, and we're going to get back to that too in a minute. But now I'm talking about Ezekiel 34. It's a much closer parallel parable. But you're going to see some differences too. All right, Jehovah, God Most High, sends His servant, the Son of David, to judge between the rams and the he-goats, between the fat sheep and the lean. In this case, it's the fat sheep and the rams who are fed by the Son of David with judgment, compared to the lean sheep and the goats. He cares for them. He judges the fat sheep. But the false shepherds of the flock were themselves, there's a third character here, a set of characters. The false shepherds of the flock, they themselves were killing the fat sheep to feed upon themselves.
Isn't that what wolves do?
Yes, that's what false shepherds. Yeah, the good shepherd does this. The thief comes in to steal and destroy and sacrifice the sheep. Well, these are the false shepherds here are killing the fat flock, and they're not doing anything to help the skinny, underfed, malnourished flock, the least of the flock.
See, I love naming names, and when you say stuff like that, I think of Benny Hinn, or Joel Osteen, or Joyce Myers. I think all of these people, maybe Joyce Myers not so much, but the previous two definitely, I think they're pretty despicable, and that's exactly what they're doing. They're not just fleecing the flock.
Kind of doing a Ponzi scheme.
Yeah, and even worse than that, they're selling them a fluffy little gospel that has nothing to do with the blood of Christ. You know?
Yeah.
Santa Claus, you know?
Yep.
Remember, Jesus is your Santa Claus.
Yep. Jesus is your Santa Claus. Well,
you mentioned the wolves, and you got to throw that in there.
This is, they're oppressing, but the false shepherds are oppressing. This is kind of an important point. They're oppressing all the flock, not just the baby goats, but also the mature, healthy flock. But the mature, healthy flock are also the ones being judged, not the skinny little scrawny flock. They're being also judged for bullying the weaker members of the flock, the little baby goats and stuff.
So, I mean, are there any good fattened ones? I mean, or is
as far as this parable goes, no. But the bad ones in the flock are just as much victims as the good ones in the flock.
Right, because you get the wolves, which is the third category.
The third category, the false prophet, the false teachers, and in effect, they're sort of the false teachers are also part of the flock. I mean, it's not like they're completely. It's not like they're not part of the flock. It's not like they're the servants of God. They're the ones in the highest authority that God chose.
It's like we keep turning things on their head. It's like we're turning Dante's vision of hell right on its head.
Yeah.
You know, the holiest people are in the deepest pit of hell, and
yeah, it's kind of weird.
Common, regular people are the ones that, and you know what? Don't you see that in Jesus' life? Wasn't it the common, regular people that he really wanted to be around the most?
Yeah. Although, hey, again, he accepts invitations to go eat at lunch with those Pharisees. He brings them into his own house to have a convention basically with them, and the common people are kind of standing around outside. That particular time, which is kind of by the way, which is kind of interesting because a lot of people deny that Jesus had a house, but one of the synoptics, I can't remember which version of it tells that story, but that version of the story, they make it pretty clear it's Jesus' house.
Oh, really? Yeah. Well, I assume that Mary had someplace to sleep.
Yeah, Mary and the brothers and everybody had to have someplace to live. They weren't just wandering the streets, and Jesus was basically the one in charge of the family at that point. So yeah, he had a house. Duh.
Yeah, that's right. He was the oldest brother too, so that would
have
made him the man of the house.
Right. Or even if let's say the Catholic versions are correct, and Jesus was the youngest brother because the other children were children of Joseph.
That's so gay. I've never gone with that. Well, that's just so gay.
There are a few little things kind of pointing in that direction. I'm not going to say it's completely whack, but there are.
Really? Okay, now
well, I'll get into. I don't want.
This is worth 30 seconds. Okay,
I can't remember what they are right this moment.
Oh, you can't drop a bomb like that. All right,
I'm
whatever.
sorry.
I've always thought that like Catholics are going to do anything they can to maintain their Theotokos worship, and it's just it's funny. I mean, most of them believe that she died a virgin. Most of them believe that her hymen wasn't even broken by Christ's birth,
or was miraculously cured or something. I don't know.
Yeah, it's just strange.
But,
the Eucharist!
They have a few things that are kind of interesting in that direction, and maybe one of the Wandering Pilgrim shows will get to that.
All right. I'll let it go.
Anyway, I don't want to knock that too far. So, anyway, consequently, the Son of David will be the judge of the sheep and the goats instead of the false shepherds. And he's going to chastise those who misbehave. This is in Ezekiel again. In order to bring them to loyal behavior. He's not hopelessly punishing the fat goats and the fat sheep who were bullying the little scrawny ones. He is punishing them, but he's punishing them in order to bring them into loyal behavior. He's making a new covenant of peace with all his rebel sheep, among whom must be counted ultimately the rebel shepherds too. And there isn't any point in making a new covenant of peace except with rebels who have broken the old covenant. So he's got to be talking about making peace with the at least with the fat sheep, but also with the false shepherds. And there's other places in the Bible, which we'll get to eventually, that talk about Jesus getting a hold of those false teachers and reforming them. He's punishing them, but he's purging them. He's making them clean. And eventually they'll give him righteous worship.
Didn't you ever notice how odd, or didn't you ever think it was odd when Paul seemed rather tolerant of false teachers?
Yeah, a little bit. There was one place where he's, I can't remember if it's in Corinthians or not, because that's one of the places he's not very tolerant of false teachers. But
right.
there's one place, I don't think it's Corinthians. I think it may be one of the pastoral epistles. But there's one place where he says, look, these people coming in, they're my opponents, but you know what? As long as they're preaching Christ, I don't care.
Yeah, that's the passage I was thinking of. I think
Christ
it's in
be
Timothy.
magnified.
Yeah,
He'll take care of things.
I've always thought that was really weird because it's like Paul is the Calvinist's favorite dude because he's so doctrinal and so much. Yeah. And it just seems like the guy that was the biggest stickler for doctrine was also the one who said there must needs be heresies among us.
Yeah, yeah, there must needs be. He's kind of like, oh, well, whatever. And he does hand over false teachers to being, well, he hands them over to death. To being killed. Now, we'll have to get to that later. That's in Paul. We're dealing with Jesus right now. We're going to be dealing with Jesus a lot for a while. So
I'm sorry. I'm shutting up now.
Well, So anyway, if the fat sheep and the rams are hopefully fed with judgment, even to destruction in Ezekiel, compared to the pitiful goats, whom the mature and healthy flock were bullying and starving and didn't try to save in Ezekiel, even from the false shepherds who were destroying and sacrificing everybody, especially the healthy flock, for their own self-interests, that leads more strong evidence that the colossus of the baby goats in Matthew 25 are being sent into a hopeful punishment, not a hopeless one, with the goal of bringing them to be mature goats instead. Also notice, they're clearly part of the flock.
Quick question. What's the book definition of Colossus?
We are going to be getting to that pretty soon here.
Okay. Sorry. Didn't mean to jump ahead.
Yeah. Because before we get to the question of what Colossus means, and Eonian means, and Eonian Fire, and things like that.
Establish the usage and the
I have got to establish the context, the thematic and narrative context of all these parables leading into it. And I have a reason for doing that.
Good call.
Okay. You'll see it. We're getting there. Okay. I will also note, by the way, while I'm passing by, goats in a flock, if they're mature goats, they've been well trained, they're the best members of the flock. They're the people. They're not the people. They're the animals. They're the animals that the shepherd depends on. They're kind of like guard dogs.
I have some experience.
Yep.
I was just about to say.
Leave them alone, and they'll take care of themselves, unlike those stupid sheep.
I worked on farms and stuff, and sheep are the worst. They are by far the worst. They're aimless. Herding sheep, that's why they have dogs and stuff, because it's so hard to do it all
Yeah,
by
but they didn't
yourself.
have dogs to do that back
But
in first century Palestine.
Oh yeah, they did, but they didn't
They
use
did
them very
some?
often. Yeah,
Not
they
a
didn't.
lot.
Yeah, not a lot. No, that was like rich people had that.
Yeah.
But yeah, the goats are very intelligent. Goats are very personable, and goats love ramming things.
Yeah, and the goats will lead the sheep around.
Yes, absolutely. That's
once they're trained.
Well, not even like when you mix goats and sheep together, especially if they're goats that have been around a lot of people. The goats will naturally, like, you ever notice those dogs that just bark at people who are spastic until they calm down? Well, that's kind of the way the goats are. If the sheep are going, if the sheep are too this way and that way, the goats, they'll ram them. They'll actually just ram them. They'll be like, chill out, stay there, Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and this also gets back kind of topically, this is why there's the Judas.
Eric touched on something pretty interesting there, because look at a lot of the stuff that's going on right now, where a lot of the world is correcting Christians. Like the televangelists, what do they call it? The something gospel, the prosperity gospel.
Prosperity gospel. Yeah, we were talking about that a minute ago too. Eric was talking about that with the prosperity gospel, and it's coming into a lot of criticism, not just from other Christians, but
from the world.
From the world.
Yeah. And that would be the goat that's ramming the sheep.
Yeah, the world is the goat ramming the sheep in.
Yeah, I can go with that.
But of course, in this parable, though, the goats are the weak goats are the people who are actually, see, when Jesus is taking the Ezekiel parable, he's shuffling the characters around a little. He's taking the false shepherds and he's putting them into the place of the least of the flock. Okay, he's putting them in the place of the baby goats, basically. And you got to remember, the people he's talking to would have expected, they probably would have been familiar with Ezekiel in this parable. They would have expected the fat, healthy sheep to be the ones in trouble. They would have been expecting the skinny, poor, scrawny goats or herd animals to be the ones that Jesus was going to save and say, you did a good job. So he's reversing expectation there too. And we look at it and it's like, oh, sheep and goats. Those darn goats.
that fractal Bible, that's one thing that you and I were talking about before we went on air, is how the Bible's like a fractal.
Judas goat. What does that Judas goat do? He leads those sheep around.
I've had Azazel running through my mind all night. Do you have any associations with that?
No, I don't.
Yeah, I haven't built any connections yet, but I can't help but think there must be something there, because this seems like a common typology that's used from both the Old Testament and the New, and the fact that the scapegoat was a goat and the one sacrificed was a sheep, it just seems like there must be something there. I just haven't made the connection.
For practical purposes, what they would do is they would have the goat lead the sheep into the slaughtering pen, and the goat would jump out, but the sheep follow the goat.
Right.
And so, but of course, the goat's smart enough to do that, and is trusted to help lead the sheep around. So, now, baby goats, they are a terror. They are the worst. They are the worst things to try to train. Okay, so.
Oh, they're crazy. They jump around. I actually helped give birth to like 3 goats.
See, my mom had goats when she was growing up too. Didn't have sheep, but she had goats, so she knew about baby goats. Mm-hmm. So when I was pointing this out to her, she was like, "That says baby goat?" Yeah, I know what that means. Those things are terrible. They are the spoiledest little rotten things, and it takes forever to train them. Well, yeah, that's kind of what Jesus is talking about here too. But if you can ever get them trained, then they are the most efficient and reliable members of the flock. So
all along we've had this idea that sheep are better than goats, and that the sheep are the church, and that the goats are the world. Why do we see it like that? Why do we read it through that lens?
I think part of it is because we want to make sure that we're on the side of the people who look like they're being saved here. And so we're going to read everything, instead of reading things self-critically in the Bible, we read things in such a way as to flatter ourselves. And we're told clearly, any time you go to church, eventually, 1 time out of 4, eventually the preacher's going to say, now remember, you're supposed to be reading this to put yourself in the place here. And so, you know, this is talking to you and it's warning you about these things. Well, yes, but we've kind of lost the thrust of just how much it is warning us.
That's an excellent answer. I think what we've lost the thrust of is we're supposed to be skeptical to our own condition.
Yeah, we're supposed
not
to be
trying to we're not trying. We shouldn't be trying to justify it. We should be skeptical.
Yeah, we should be putting ourselves in the place of the chief of sinners. If we're not doing that, if we're not seriously doing that, we are 100% failing being
Couldn't
good
agree
Christians.
with you more. Absolutely.
Yeah. Now, once the connection of this judgment parable to Ezekiel 34 is noticed, now it's time to go back to the first of the 4 judgment parables back at the end of chapter 24. And that's the first that sync up this whole thing topically. Jesus starts this sequence not with the parable of the foolish virgins at what we now call 25:1, but with the parable of the abusive chief servant at the end of what we call 24. And this guy says in his heart, "My Lord is delaying," and he begins to beat his fellow slaves and to be eating and drinking with the drunken. When the Lord of that slave whom he has placed over his household, here's some themes in there, to give them nourishment in season, when that Lord returns on a day and hour which the wicked administrator does not know, and even is hoping won't be soon, the Lord shall be cutting that rebel highest chosen servant of his apart and appointing him a place with the hypocrites, where the lamentation will be and the gnashing of the teeth. So in fact, at least 3 out of the 4 warning parables here are aimed not only at misbehaving Christians, which the 5 foolish virgins also count among, but at misbehaving Christians who are appointed by Christ as leaders. And then, once again, you have the connection with the devil and his rebels, angels, seeing as how, on some theories, and see how this fits together, they were not only created good, but rebelled from being in a high authority assigned to them by God. Now, at last, we are in a position to ask and to answer the question whether the term Eonian Colossus at the end of Matthew 25 refers to an inherently hopeless punishment, since if the term allows any leeway at all for hopeful punishment, then the context of the parable and the context of all these other parables that are connected immediately to it would determine the meaning. And that context definitely warns us against interpreting God's punishment of rebels as hopeless. So, how much leeway does that term Colossus give us?
How much, Alex?
Is there an Alex here? Oh, okay, all right.
It's a joke.
Well,
you know?
we know a guy named Alex Smith. I thought he might be here.
I was thinking of Alex Trebek.
Okay. All right, well, everyone agrees Colossus is a term for punishment. If you look in the scholars, everyone's going to agree with that, because that's pretty obvious. But it's also part of the history of the Greek language in that time and place. And I'm pretty sure everybody agrees it's borrowed as a metaphor from an agricultural term for cleaning sick branches from a vine.
Trimming.
Yeah, it's pruning. Yeah. There is also significant evidence in the Greco-Roman culture outside the New Testament that Colossus was often used for remedial punishment, hopeful punishment, hoping that the people who are being punished will straighten up and fly right. Christian Universalists often point this out when defending against this statement as evidence for hopelessly final punishment. But let me acknowledge, before I carry that line of analysis too far, the author of GosMatt translating Jesus into Greek, or Jesus if for some reason he's speaking Greek and not Aramaic here, well, that's not likely, might have used the term for some other meaning. There are many foreign words ported into Greek and Hebrew by the scriptural authors, using those words in significantly different fashions than the surrounding culture did, especially when they're talking about theology. Colossus might be one of them. It might mean hopeful punishment to those Greeks and Romans. It might not mean hopeful punishment to the people who are writing the New Testament, or to Jesus, if in whatever it is he's saying. And I have to admit that. I mean, it's possible. That's why you're checking the context. So I'll give a particularly pertinent example here, because there is another Greek term for punishment called timoria. And it's commonly recognized in the surrounding culture to be a term for hopeless punishment. The punishment that has nothing to do with trying to reestablish the person being punished. It's purely to satisfy the guy who's doing the punishment. It has nothing whatever. It's accidental if the other guy repents and tries to do right afterwards. Okay? But one of the few times it's actually used for for punishment in the New Testament, it turns out to be for hopeful punishment. We're not going to get to that tonight. That's much later. But there are direct relations between that term and the goal of Jesus judging those who do the evil things, being to bring them to honor the Father and the Son, and there's a connection with what we were talking about last week. So what people disagree on when they're talking about Colossus is whether, analogically speaking, the sick branches are thrown hopelessly into a fire to be burned and done away with, and Jesus' imagery at John 15:6 might mean that. Although that might be a rather different meaning if the purpose of the unquenchable fire, even in Gehenna, is to salt our hearts so that we will be at peace with one another. But we'll talk about that later.
That's a pretty hardcore salt, man.
Yeah, well, that's some pretty hardcore salt. But we'll get to that in the next week. Or it might is Colossus here in Matthew 25 like what Paul is talking about? Whether the sick branches can be grafted back into the vine of Israel once they are healed, even if they've been cut off previously. That is definitely, St. Paul doesn't use the term Colossus, but that is definitely the analogy he's using in Romans 11. Well, the concept of the term can, by reference to Romans 11, refer to hopeful punishment. So this leaves, that's one way immediately that leaves the question open for the context to settle the issue here at Matthew 25.
Go ahead. I was just going to say, one way or the other, what I'm seeing, the common theme that I'm seeing is that there's a setting aside of something, whether it's permanent or for a time. There's something that is divided and put over here. Is that fair?
Yeah, that's fair.
Okay.
Yeah. The question is the purpose for it. Now, like I said, Paul doesn't actually use the term Colossus in Romans 11. He's just using the same a metaphorical imagery, okay, that's behind the term. Are there other places in the New Testament that use the term Colossus? Well, yes, there are. 1 John 4:18. And it also counts as evidence that the term cannot intrinsically refer to hopeless punishment. John writes there, "Fear is not in love, but perfect love is casting out the fear. For the fear has Colossus, and the one who is fearing is not perfected in the love." But the whole point there is that the one who is fearing is not perfected in the love. That doesn't mean perfect love is not casting out the fear. The same verse says it is. Nor does the fact that the perfect love is casting out fear mean fear has no Colossus purpose, because the verse affirms it does.
So basically, what he's saying is that you're not in union with Christ in this.
Yeah. Well, the gist of the verse is God acts to bring about perfect love, which itself casts out fear. Thus also God acts to cast out Colossus as a consequence of bringing about perfect love in a person. I think it's George MacDonald who, commenting on this passage, said, and maybe C.S. Lewis, come to think of it, my brain seems to think it's C.S. Lewis. I take it is C.S. Lewis. I don't remember where exactly. But he says, yeah, there are lots of things that cast out fear other than love. Drunkenness can cast out fear. Lust can cast out fear. Lots of things can cast out fear other than love.
A bottle of port. A bottle of port.
Bottle of port can cast out fear. He said, but we have to be careful. I think he is following MacDonald on this. He said, you have to be, what we're seeking, the goal here is to have nothing cast out our fear short of perfect love. And that's what this verse from 1 John is talking about.
It sounds like something that would be out of the four loves, but maybe that's just an easy answer.
Maybe.
The C.S. Lewis quote.
I don't think it's the four loves, but that might be possible because it was topically in there. Yeah.
I know I've read it.
I know. I can't remember where exactly, but I know I've read it. Maybe it's probably Mere Christianity. I'm sure it's Mere Christianity.
So I hope I'm hearing this right. This is how my brain's processing it. I'm getting this continual sense of division, of setting aside, and when it says perfect love casts out all fear,
and also casts out Colossus.
Casts out Colossus. Casts out that division. Casts out that separation from Christ. Forsakes that individuality and instead enjoins himself, as he prayed in John 17, that we would be one with him as he is one with the Father.
Yeah. Yeah. And notice that it's not God cutting us off exactly. It's us cutting ourselves off from God by sinning.
Right.
And so perfect love is reaching out to us to reconcile us. And boy, do I have a whole episode on that coming up sometime in the future.
So this is the... Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
No, I was going to say, well, you can go through the Bible in the New Testament, especially checking what reconciliation means and the cognates of that, and propitiation and the cognates of that, and you will run into some really interesting things.
I know, it's a very tangled web. Atonement's another word that's like that. It's very
atonement is reconciliation is the same word that atonement is translated through.
Okay, yeah. These words, they're so much richer, and what we got to remember is that even though they're writing the New Testament in Greek, they're writing it from a Hebrew mindset.
Yep.
And that Hebrew mindset is heavily weighted in typology, in poetry, and in this artistic way of drawing a mental picture of a thing, whereas the Greeks were more into technical schematics, I guess would be the best way to say it.
Yeah, that's one way of putting it. Yeah, that's a very good way of putting it. But hey, speaking of the Hebrew mindset, another one of the verb form of kalazo is kalazo, and that's found in Acts 4:21 to describe punishment being considered by the Sanhedrin for the apostles. In other words, it's parallel to synagogue punishment, like
cutting them off from Israel.
Yeah, but the point to synagogue punishment was to shame the person and have them repent and come back into the synagogue.
Mm-hmm.
That's why they would give the 40 lashes minus 1.
Yeah, if they give them all 40, they'd die.
Well, yeah, and also, right, symbolically they'd be dead, whether or not they survived it or not. Also, there's a legal issue there involved. You're not really supposed to do that in Rome. The Romans were supposed to be the ones who kill somebody. So, but
that was the old saying, was that the reason why it's 40 minus 1 is because they gave them that one last one. 40 lashes would kill you, but 39 would almost kill you.
Yeah, well, and legally the idea was if you got 40 lashes, you were legally considered dead.
That sucks.
Also, if you got 39 lashes, they could come back, they could heal you and give you more later. Whereas if you had gotten your 40 lashes, you had paid the ultimate penalty. If you survived, great, but they couldn't punish you anymore.
That sounds so Catholic.
Yeah. Well, but notice now we've got the verse. The term is being used in a Hebrew Jewish connotation, a cultural connotation for hopeful punishment, not hopeless punishment. All right, that leaves over 2 Peter 2:9, where the unrighteous are kept for punishing, there's the verb form again, kalazo, for the day of judgment. This has parallel connections with the epistle from Jude, which says many of the same things in somewhat different language and more briefly. And Jude says some pretty strong things early in his brief epistle that I'll have to be coming back to much later. But among other things, he talks at verses 14 and 15, he only has one chapter, about God Most High, citing an apocryphal prophecy of Ezekiel, by the way. But he's talking there about God Most High coming with all his holy ones. There's that connection to GosMatt 25 again. Coming with all his holy ones to convict the unjust of their injustice. Now, that term that we're translating convict there, that's how the New American Standard and some other English translations render it. That term is of no small importance, because in Greek, it's a technical term for exposing one's sin in order to shame the person into learning and doing better. That's exactly how Jesus himself uses the term in GosMatt 18, verse 15, in an incident we'll be getting to soon, like next week, when he talks about trying to lead misbehaving persons in the church to stop sinning. If your brother sins, go and elegson him. I can't quite pronounce it. It's elegson, E-L-E-G-X-O-N in English letters. Go and elegson him, expose him. That's what the term literally means. Between you and him, in other words, in private. And if he shall listen to you, you're gaining your brother. That's the same term for conviction that's being used in Jude, which is paralleling the same scene, more or less, being talked about in 2 Peter, where he's talking about the punishment that God is visiting when he comes with his angels, with his holy ones, just like at the beginning of the parable of the judgment parable of the sheep and the goats. So it's all interconnected. Now, if you expose your brother in private to what he's doing, you and one other person come along and do it in private, And if that doesn't work, well, you keep upgrading the exposure until you find something that works, until you find a level that works. Now, you could get to the point where the erring brother has to be put out of the congregation. He's just causing too much trouble. He's got to be put out of the synagogue, basically. This is synagogue discipline. But Jesus is talking about this in terms of the church, the ecclesia. But even if he's put out of the congregation and treated like a pagan and a traitor, in this case a Roman tax collector, what are we supposed to be doing with pagans and traitors? We're supposed to be evangelizing them into the church.
Yep.
Jesus has a lot of positive things to say about tax collectors coming into the kingdom, even ahead of those like the Pharisee parties who regarded themselves as the best and most faithful servants of God. So being regarded as a pagan and a tax collector, not really a hopeless punishment situation either.
And a lot of people might not realize that the term tax collector or publican in the New Testament, depending on the translation that you use, was not what we would consider the IRS. This was basically henchmen that were
they're traitors against Israel.
They're turncoats to their own people, that Rome would hire out these local henchmen that would shake down people to pay their taxes, and they'd take their cut off the top.
Right, as much as they wanted to, as long as they paid what was owed to Rome.
They were really the shittiest of the shitty when you get down to it.
Yeah, absolutely. And Jesus runs into several of them and calls one of them, guess who it was? Matthew.
Matthew Levi.
Yep. Calls one of them to actually be one of the apostles.
It's actually it's a pretty comedic scene when it happens too.
Yeah. And that's one of the arguments about the attribution of Matthew as the author of the apostle, because the tax collector is not really the person you would want to be promoting your gospel with as the author.
Oh, damn it! You know what I just realized? You know what? Cops are gonna go to heaven too.
Yeah.
For realsies. For realsies.
For realsies.
Damn it.
All right, back to the term Colossus. So it does mean hopeful punishment at least once in 1 John, maybe twice in Acts 4, and notice the topical connections there via Jude 15 to hopeful punishment in Matthew 18. And the concept, as we'll talk about later a long time from now when we get to a fuller discussion of Romans 11, the concept definitely can involve hopeful instead of hopeless punishment. In fact, Paul actually warns us that we had better not despise those people currently cut off from the vine, because if God can cut them off, he can cut us off too. And if God cuts them off, he can bring them back in and cut us off. And that's still getting back to the same theme that we're talking about here in Matthew 25, where the last is the first and the first is the last, and the people who thought that those guys over there were definitely going to be hopelessly punished. Turns out that's the wrong attitude to have about the situation. They themselves are the ones going into the punishment. Now, ouch. Uniform testimony in favor of hopeless punishment elsewhere for that term Colossus wouldn't necessarily invalidate the contextual argument here. In other words, it might mean hopeless punishment somewhere else and yet still be used here for hopeful punishment. That's why I've gone to a lot of trouble to talk about the context. But as it happens, a lot of the other times, the few other times that it's used, it tends to be kind of pointing toward hopeful punishment. And that definitely helps. So, since the term can, at least plausibly, refer to hopeful punishment elsewhere in the Scriptures, the term itself is no bar at all to a contextual conclusion that ought to be interpreted that way here. And the contextual argument suggests the term ought to be regarded as hopeful anyway, when the Colossus is coming from God. If it's coming from somebody else, you might be screwed. But if it's coming from God, that's his intention, is to help you.
I made a connection in my mind. Now every time you say Colossus, all I hear is time out.
Time out?
Yeah, that's what it seems to me. That's the image I get in my head when I'm thinking
okay. I thought you meant that there was some connection between something like the Colossus of Rhodes and time out. But yeah, you're putting time out. That's right.
Yeah. It's funny that you mentioned that. I wanted to ask you towards the end of the broadcast, actually, because it seems like a tangent, but I was wondering why the Colossus at Rhodes was called the Colossus. It was the one
it's spelled differently. It's probably a different word.
Okay.
I honestly, and I've wondered that too. I've wondered if there's some kind of connection between the terms. I have not been able to find a connection yet, but I haven't really looked either. It's an interesting question. After all, I mean, there are the Colossians, and they're living in Colossae.
Mm-hmm.
So
and then you got the dude in X-Men.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
You know, the steel dude, Colossus.
Yeah, the steel dude, the Russian guy.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Piotr.
He's one of the nicest guys too in the X-Men.
Did you read comic books when you were a kid?
I still read comic books sometimes.
Oh, you're awesome.
I have all kinds of trivial knowledge on comic books. Don't get me started.
All right. We're going to have to make a comic book show. All right.
Yeah. All right. So, what about? So we talked about Colossus, and we've seen. Well, you know, the contextual argument definitely says we ought to regard Colossus as not being hopeless, at least. And if we look at the way the term is used elsewhere in the New Testament, it's kind of pointing in that way, and the concept of it is definitely being used as hopeful. So, what about the adjective Aeonian?
So it's not hopeless, but it just sucks a lot.
Yeah, it's not hopeless. It just sucks a lot. It sucks to be them. I mean, they're being put into the fire with the devil and his angels that were prepared for the devil and his angels. This is not a thing that's, I mean, it's described in ways like being cut into pieces and being thrown into the outer darkness where the wailing is and the gnashing of the teeth. This is not something you want to happen. But it's not hopeless, or we shouldn't regard it as hopeless. And I'm going to distinguish that very carefully toward the end of the lecture here, because I don't want to push the argument that I'm trying to make here too far. I think it can be pushed too far. But we'll get to that presently. Okay.
I just wanted to let you know, Jason, I can go as late as you want, but you are running on over 2 hours right now. So
yeah,
if you
7:08. Yep.
If you have to get up early in the morning, I was just mentioning that for you. But like I said, I can be here as long as you want to be.
I think I'm going to be able to be finished by 8 o'clock and have a 3-hour show again, 3-hour tour.
Every time we set a time for any topic, it's like, okay, we're going to do it 2 hours. That means 5.
That means 5. Yeah. It's expensive. All right, we've got the adjective. Okay. The adjective Aeonian. All right, that's the adjective form of eon or age. And it doesn't translate into English very well. It's like agey or age-ish. Now, any student of agey, eoni, it's eoni, eonish. That doesn't make any sense.
I like Tim's wording, pertaining to the age.
Pertaining to the age. That's right. That's very good, and that comes from some classical author somewhere. I can't remember who exactly. But
probably George MacDonald.
I'm thinking it's like Henson maybe, or possibly Winchester. I'm not sure. Anyway.
You mean the dude that did the Muppets or the dude that did the gun?
Sorry.
I'm going to shut up.
Now, any student of Biblical Greek ought to either know or quickly discover that the authors could use this term to refer to events or objects that are not actually eternal, but which have a beginning and or an ending. Now, admittedly, this is much more common in the Old Testament, with the Greek term translating several Hebrew terms, most importantly, ad and olam. But the Church Fathers, writing after the New Testament, tended to follow suit if they knew Greek well. They often used Eonian to refer to situations or things that they clearly showed they thought would have an end. And I could easily do a whole episode on scriptural examples, again mostly from the Old Testament, where the term refers to things that have an ending. But that would quickly get boring, and I'll be mentioning a few examples anyway as I go along, including some, So, and besides, strictly speaking, the punishment here cannot be literally eternal because it does at least have a beginning. Whereas, on the other hand, the Zoan Aeonian, the Eonian life from God given to the faithful, does not in itself have a beginning, nor an end, even though at some point the faithful begin to receive it. And even though rebel angels and Adam and Eve, or whoever our first ancestors were, they must have lost it when they fell. Regardless of how historically literal the account of Genesis should be taken, if it means anything at all, it means our first rebelling ancestors lost the life God was sharing with them. And the tree of life is later regarded in the New Testament as a figure for Christ, who is himself Eonian life. Now, to this observation, a proponent of hopeless punishment could still reasonably apply the classical objection, it goes back at least as far as St. Augustine, still commonly used today. In comparing the life to the punishment, the adjectives ought to be considered equally parallel. If Eonian means never-ending for the life, how could Eonian not mean, by virtue of comparison, never-ending for the punishment? Or vice versa. If Eonian does not mean never-ending for the punishment, how could it hope to mean never-ending for the life? So from this direction, in a weird sort of way, our hope for the life must be in direct proportion to the hopelessness of the punishment. If the hopelessness is threatened, the hope is threatened. The most immediate way around this objection would be to note again that the Eonian life from God does not have a beginning, whereas the Eonian punishment does. And so in any case, the adjectives are being used to describe situations that are not temporally parallel. So obviously it must be possible for two usages of the adjective to refer to something which is eternal and something which is technically not. Now, someone could reasonably reply that what is being compared is the final result, not the origination. Okay, maybe so. But even then, you can't base an argument for the adjective applying to the final result based on an intrinsically meaning, on the Eonian intrinsically meaning eternal in exactly the same way each time, because it doesn't. So even on that interpretation, Eonian does mean one thing when applied to the punishment, but something significantly different, though admittedly still kind of similar, when applied to the life, even if the objector doesn't think this difference is significant about the final result either way. But this is why I started the argument by carefully examining all the immediate and local context leading to the comparison of Eonian punishment into Eonian fire for the baby goats, the least of Christ's flock, who are being punished for refusing to have mercy on the least of Christ's flock, living in conditions typical of divine punishments for sin, and the reward of Eonian life for the mature flock. And it's why I went on to look at the extended context of that contextual argument. So from that direction, we also have very strong contextual grounds for expecting the same term to mean two related but ultimately different things there, and for this difference to be significant as to what we should expect about the final results either way. But since we should admit that usually identical terms in comparison should be interpreted identically, let's go on. Let's continue by observing that non-universalists themselves, specifically in order to argue against a universalistic conclusion from other scriptures, are absolutely committed to interpreting identical terms in important close topical context, even in direct comparison, as meaning substantially different things. One famous example is in Romans 5, where direct, immediate, parallel comparisons of the word all are required not, in fact, to both mean all, and similar comparisons of the word for many are required not to, in fact, both mean whatever many means. Because it's entirely clear enough that if many, by contextual comparison to all, means all each time many is used there, and if all means all each time all is used there, Paul must be teaching universal salvation from sin by Christ. Typically, non-universalists appeal to other indirectly related testimony to try to argue against this, rather than to direct context in Romans 5, including linguistic arguments demonstrating that the term for all can mean only many. My point here is not to argue that's a faulty approach. On the contrary, I agree it's an approach worth trying. I'm not even trying to argue about Romans 5. That's a whole other later episode. I'm just giving an example where non-universalists, as such, must be committed, whatever their reasons may be, even if they're good reasons, to reading identical terms very differently in closely connected context on the topic of salvation. Similarly, in order to avoid a universal salvation conclusion from analyzing Colossians 1, hey, there's Collis, non-universalists must either deny that the same words used in affirming the other divine supremacy of Christ in scope and power over creation do not have the same meaning when taken immediately afterward about the scope and power of God's action to reconcile all things to himself through the blood of his cross, or they must deny that the same word for reconcile, when used immediately afterward to speak of the salvation of enemies of God from sin, does not mean the salvation of enemies of God from sin when speaking of the scope of reconciliation of all things to God by God through the blood of the cross. Now, again, my point here is not to argue Colossians 1. That's a whole other chapter. That's a whole other time later in a whole other episode. It's one with strong connections to Romans 5, and we'll probably get to that. I'm just giving another example where non-universalists, as such, must be committed, whatever their reasons may be, to reading identical terms very differently in closely connected context on the topic of salvation. So, you know, if I'm doing this here at Matthew 5, it's not exactly a thing that's necessarily bad. It is allowed, and I know it's allowed because non-universalists do the exact same thing when we're talking about other scriptures. So you can't just say, well, you can't read it like that. It has to be the exact same way both times. No, it doesn't. You yourself, when you're doing those other arguments, you use different terms, but you're using exactly the same terms different ways in order to get around a universalistic conclusion. And you might be right to do so. I haven't even talked about whether you're right to do so or not. I'm just saying you are doing it. And when I'm saying you're doing it, I used to do it. I wasn't always a universalist. I've been one since 2000. I've been one for about 15 years. But I wasn't always that way. I did the same thing. So I
think all of us, I mean, even to this day, if I knew where I was doing it, I'd stop it. But I think all of us do this because there's certain assumptions that we're not willing to let go of.
Yeah, that's possible. I know. But I'm trying to be as fair as possible here, that everybody's working at trying to figure out what the scriptures mean. So,
well, that's why I included myself when I say all of us. You know, we all approach things with a bias. And the more we try to say that we're not being biased at all in any way, the more blind we are to the fact that we are biased.
It's better to try to at least recognize we have biases and account for them.
Yeah, exactly.
So, now, it could be replied that the terms all and many are common general terms. I don't know how far that would stretch to include the terms in Colossians 1, but even those terms aren't the important word Eonian, are they? Maybe it's theoretically possible for Eonian to mean two superficially similar but also importantly different things in close context, but are there any biblical examples of this usage other than already in Matthew 25 itself, since the punishment cannot be as eternal as the life in regard to past natural history? Well, in fact, there are two other such times, at least. In the final blessing address of his epistle to the Romans, Paul writes in verse 25 of that 16th chapter, "A secret hushed in times Eonian has now been revealed," which it's our responsibility as Christians to proclaim this. Now, those times did not continue. They're in the process of ending. And so, in a sense, they have already ended. And will certainly end one way or another when Christ Jesus is finally proclaimed and announced and introduced as King to all creation. Nor did those times stretch without beginning into the past. So those times of the secret had a beginning, and they are having an end and will someday be completely ended, and yet they are described as Eonian. In the very same sentence, only a few words later, Paul talks about this secret of Eonian times having been manifested both now and through prophetic scriptures, thanks to the injunction of the Eonian God. The same word absolutely cannot mean only never-ending or only ending in both cases. It has to be talking about something that never ends in one case, that's God, and something that sooner and later definitely ends, which is the times of the secret.
And I have I don't know if this falls under the excluded middle thing, but to me, I see it as being like neither. It's just, well, yeah, he's the God of the age, just because he's the God of all ages, so of course he's the God of the age.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if that makes any sense.
Yeah, but it's not the secret of the age exactly. I guess it could be the secret of the age. And the God of the age.
Well, yeah, really, when you think about it, I mean, Israel was a very, very small nation throughout history prior to Christ, and even as Christianity expanded throughout the Middle Ages, I mean, it still hadn't reached the far reaches of Asia or the southern tip of Africa, or even, never mind, South America or North America.
But God isn't only the God of the age. He doesn't stop being the God of the age. So he is continuing on past that age. Whereas the secret definitely comes to an end. The times of the secret definitely are coming to an end and will completely, fully come to an end at some point.
What I'm saying is that I see both ends. I just don't see why it has to be always, just because it's God doesn't mean it has to be eternal. It's like God is eternal, but not all adjectives applied to God in its scope are eternal. Like you can say...
He's certainly more eternal than the time of the secret.
I'm saying God is eternal, okay? And I hope this isn't a rabbit trail or anything. What I'm trying to say is the adjective isn't trying to reflect that particular truth. It's trying to reflect a different truth. The scope of this particular issue, which is of this age, he is the God. And we're not talking about any other age at this point. We're talking about this age.
Well, Paul is talking about the age of the time of the secret, which is coming to an end.
Right. When I say this age, I mean a particular age.
Yeah,
You know.
okay.
I'm sorry. I'll just shut up.
Well, it's okay. And you might say, well, he's not really comparing God to the age in a way that God is superior to the age. Maybe. Maybe not. I don't know. To me, it seems like he is, but maybe there's an argument to that. But then we come to Habakkuk, whose name I can never pronounce. He's a prophet. Habakkuk. He's in
actually,
chapter 3:6.
Habakkuk.
No, if it was shut up.
Habakkuk.
If it was Hebrew, it would be Habakkuk.
Habakkuk. Oh, I'm going to try to say that for the rest of the time when I'm talking about him. Habakkuk.
Habakkuk.
Habakkuk 3:6 says, he, speaking of Jehovah in the day of the Lord to come, stood and measured the earth. He beheld and drove asunder, or startled, the nations. Yes, the perpetual mountains were shattered, as some translations have it. The eternal hills collapsed. His ways are eternal.
Now that's really weird, and that's all using olam, I assume, right? Or very
well, that's interesting. Actually, there's two words being used there. We have an example of the primitive word od. I don't know exactly how to pronounce it. It's originally similar in meaning to the other word used in this verse, which is olam. Both refer by metaphor to an extension to or even beyond an evident limit, like horizontally to or beyond the horizon, or higher than the stars in the heavens. Okay.
Well,
either way, go ahead.
As I understand Hebrew constructions, it really is all about roots and expanding upon that root. So if it's, you said on, what's the one, or?
Odd. Oh,
odd.
There's olam is one of them, and odd is the other.
Olam is one I'm familiar with, so I am very inclined to think that odd is a root of olam, but I don't know that for certain.
When I was looking at it, of course I've looked at it for several years, I have never seen anything in a concordance suggest that it is part of the root for olam.
Odd would be Aleph Dalet, I believe. Aleph Dalet would be odd.
Mm-hmm.
Olam would be Aleph Lamed. I'm failing.
What is the M sound in Hebrew? I can't remember exactly.
Yeah.
Obviously, yeah, they do sound kind of the same, don't they?
Yeah,
but again, the basic root there is probably something to do with the extending to the limit, considering the limit of something.
And even if odd is not a root of olam, I think they probably, just because of the aw sound, have a common root. In fact, I'm almost certain of that.
And the L, the lamech in there.
The lamed, yeah.
Well, there's an L. Sorry, there's not a lamech in odd. My bad.
Lamed.
Yeah, but there's what's the H sound? Anyway, I'm getting off on that.
Hey.
So that's not.
If you're talking about like a tetragrammaton, it'd be yod he wav he.
It's hey. There's a hey in there.
Yep. Oh, you gotta get the guttural, dude. Hey. It's like Hawking the Hey.
I'm so glad I never have to talk Hebrew with a sore throat.
No, dude, Hebrew is so cool because, like,
it is cool. It's awesome.
Every letter has a specific meaning, and that's why I was going back to roots and stuff. If you have an O sound, and that's not a letter itself, by the way, because Hebrew's syllabic.
Right.
So we tend to name them after the consonants. So with that, it would be the lamed, and I'd be curious to look up what the specific meaning of the character lamed would be, because, like I said, Hebrew is like, it's almost like a math equation in poetry.
Yes, it is. It's great. Well, anyway, either way, both words by metaphor are often employed to talk about the absolute, everlasting greatness of God. But both words are also occasionally used for things which aren't actually everlasting. Like here, this verse may have been expressly designed to contrast those two concepts. For not only are the mountains shattered, but the Olam hills collapse. And that's using a verb which has a double meaning of bowing down when faced with the true olam of God. Now, both those words are usually translated Eonian in biblical Greek. And this is, in fact, how the Jews translated this verse for the Greek version of the Scriptures in the Septuagint. So this is another example, a direct example of Eonian, both in Greek and also in its underlying Hebrew, meaning two similar but ultimately also very different things, not only in close proximity and not only in close topical proximity, but in actual direct immediate comparison and contrast. Those hills that looked like they were going to last forever, They don't compared to God. And
what
you can see other things about this in the scriptures too, like in Hebrews chapter 1, where the Hebraist is comparing how Christ as the original Lord, referring back to Old Testament scriptures, referring to Jehovah, that everything else wears out and disappears, but he lasts forever.
So what I'm seeing with the word Olam is, you said stretching to like the horizon or as high as it could be. I get that right?
Yeah,
I heard that.
I think the Olam is the horizontal version of this, and Ot, I think, maybe is the vertical version.
So what it seems to be saying to me is as far as the eye can see. Not that there's not a terminus, but that it's like a vanishing point.
But it can also, right, well, as far as the eye can see, or beyond that, beyond how as far as the eye can see.
Mm-hmm. Indefinite. I mean, I guess we got to keep coming back to this indefinite element, because I know everyone harps on Strong's because that was inspired, and I happen to think that Thayer's is superior to Strong's myself.
I have seen Thayer's lexicon. It is pretty good. Yeah. Yeah,
but even that, you need an expository. You need an expository concordance, or not concordance, but lexicon, and that's where Vines comes in. And Vines,
I've got Vines. You can see on my shelf back here.
Yeah, I see it right behind you. I saw that last week.
They are definitely not Universalists, by the way.
No, they're not, but it's very easy
to... people are, I don't think.
So, anyway, go ahead.
All right, so we have another direct example of Eonian, meaning two kind of similar things, but ultimately very different, in a direct topical contrast with each other, between one being superior and the other one being inferior. Now, in the example of Habakkuk, say it for me, Habakkuk.
Habakkuk.
Habakkuk 3.
In multisyllabic. Habakkuk. In multisyllabic Hebrew words, the emphasis is almost always on the last syllable. Habakkuk.
Habakkuk. Okay. In Habakkuk 3, the context immediately clarifies the distinction. Now, I'm arguing that in the judgment of the sheep, or of the mature flock, and the baby goats, the nearby context also clarifies a similar distinction. Both the life and the colossus, or the punishment, are uniquely from God. And both can go on for a long time, but the similarity is in there. The Eonian life goes on forever by God's intention, but God intends an end to the Eonian colossus. So such a different double usage of Eonian in immediate context may not happen often, but it does happen to various degrees, including at least once in the closest possible comparison of things described by the term Eonian. Now, a friend of mine, Alex Smith, he contributed something to this once upon a time, and I'm going to kind of quote him extensively here. He's an administrator at the Evangelical Universalist Forum with me, and was the chief administrator there for a while. His example is something like this: and the junior cricketers will go to the annual training, but the parents will go to the annual meeting. Now, does the adjective annual mean exactly the same thing each time? Yes. Does it tell us exactly how long the training or meeting is? No. But you could fairly suggest that because they are junior, the kids probably won't be 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. Similarly, the common usages of the verbs training and meeting probably indicate it's not going to take all year. And you could make other such predictions, especially if, for example, the day before you were told the training was a beginner's course. However, that you know other information about the meeting and training doesn't change the meaning of the word annual. Bob went on a long walk. Bill went on a long drive. Does the adjective long mean exactly the same thing each time? Yes. Both times they mean measuring an indistinctly large distance from end to end. How many thousand meters was the walk and how many was the drive? We aren't told. Suppose we guess the drive is longer because cars are capable of going faster. That doesn't mean we are misusing the word long here or being inconsistent. Similarly, if we are told that Bob was 100 years old and had a walking frame, and Bill was 25 and was on a holiday, it's fair to say the drive was very likely longer, and you're still not being illogical. For example, the sentence could be said by Bill's mother when showing photos to the family. For Bob, it was a long walk. For Bill, it was a long drive, even if the kilometers or miles of the walk and the drive weren't identical. You can also say it another way. The term being used here, Eonian, basically means lasting. Lasting how long? Depends on the context. So now we can also go with the interpretation I myself personally prefer, where Eonian is used to describe things that come especially from God. You may have heard me use this a little bit before, just previously in what I was talking about. Yeah, even God from God in Romans 16:26 may thus be rendered, referring to the Son. And no one who affirms very God of very God will dare deny that's a proper idea. Well, if we do that, then there's no problem at all. The life and the punishment and the fire reserved for the devil and his angels are both equally and especially from God. In fact, the phraseology there in Matthew 25, when talking about the fire, is not the Eonian fire. The phraseology is the fire, the Eonian. It's both. They're both using direct article terms. It's not the adjective form of it is the adjective form. It is the adjective form of eon, but it's being made into a noun and put in parallel with the fire. Well, if you do it that way, that's an Aramaic form to emphasize how close the two things are in identity. And if
I just wanted to ask real quick. You say that you're seeing the word primarily being applied to things from God. What do we see in secular usage of the word?
That happens to some extent in Plato. And at the time of the New Testament was written, there was Neoplatonic. And so in that case, he's talking about the ground of all existence being the Eonian, the eternal. So but it's also a Hebrew Aramaicism, because they will talk about God being the eternal.
Yeah, it just seems to me like even in the secular usage and in context in Scripture, it doesn't seem so much like we're talking about a duration of time a lot of the time. I mean,
no, it's talking about a quality of something, or it's talking about something that transcends natural time, but there's only one thing that transcends natural time. That's God.
And it's the eternal, yeah.
Yeah, he who is the eternal.
And this is, I think this is the difficulty, is that we're taking these transcendent concepts and we're trying to frame them in such an accessible way that we're really dumbing it down to the point where it means something other than what it's supposed to mean.
Yeah, or we're making it a little more particular than it's really kind of trying to get a general idea or feeling across, and we're trying to make it more particular than it is. And I have more examples on that too, because I can't quote them right this second, but there are actually, it is possible to trace the usage of the Greek term eon and Eonian, and the relevant Latin version, which is eum. Okay, it's actually the same word, it's just differently pronounced. And you can see how the Greek and Latin authors were using it from classical antiquity right up to the time of the first Christian century.
I've just yet to hear a quantitative usage of the word. It seems like it's almost always qualitative.
Well, they're using it in a, they're not using it in a standard quantitative way. They're using it in routinely using it to talk about things that does have an ending.
Mm-hmm.
So, and probably it comes from, in both cases, the root meaning coming from Persian, I think maybe. The root meaning for the term is life, like somebody's life, which kind of is great because Eonian life is the life of lives.
Yeah.
And the fire becomes the fire of life. See?
Yeah.
I don't know how far you can actually press that, but you can go. I bet you can get pretty far in the New Testament doing that.
You know,
it's Hebrew too, because it gets into the idea that God is the God of life, is the living God of life.
Being the trichotomist that I am, it just kind of dawned on me that we have Bios, Zoe, and I guess maybe Ion could be put into that as the third part, the spirit.
Yeah, the spirit. Ion is practically the spiritual life. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
But originally it was regarded as an indistinct length of time that would correspond to, but it's still a metaphor. It's a metaphor based on the idea that the word originally meant the life of a person, and that that's the lifetime of a person. How long is that? Until he dies.
Yeah.
It could be a long time. He might not die. If he's immortal, then he never dies. But you know, but it's variable. So again, that's just another example of the variable meaning of the term, even in the times that we're talking about the scriptures were written. Okay.
Yeah, I think the example of walking and driving is perfect for this application.
Yeah, and I thank Alex for that.
Very accessible.
I hope he's watching. He probably is.
Who's that?
Alex Smith. He was the one with the walking and driving metaphor that I used, that I borrowed there. He's an administrator at the Evangelical Universalist.com.
Cool.
So where it was, and he runs one of the Facebook groups too. Started it. So let's say, but going back again to my idea that you can use the adjective to talk about something that comes uniquely from God, or even as a euphemism to talk about God himself. And there is actually evidence of that in the parable, because the fire, the Eonian fire, isn't called the Eonian fire exactly. It's called the fire, the Eonian. And as an Aramaic Hebraism, that's a euphemism. That's talking about God. You're talking about the fire, which is the eternal one.
Fire.
That's our reference to our God, the consuming fire. And next week I'm going to be arguing that this has a lot of relevance to how we should understand the unquenchable fire in Gehenna. But that usage is entirely neutral to the question of whether the punishment is unending or whether it ends. It might or might not end, depending on how God decides to do it. But then so much for using the term in itself as definite evidence that the punishment must be unending. Now, someone could ask, well, what if the issue is pressed that being uniquely from God could mean Eonian life might or might not end? Well, okay, look. Eonian life, God is essentially Eonian life. The life of the self-existing foundation of all reality is not going to end. You can be pretty sure of that. You don't have to worry about that being threatened by some kind of linguistic argument, okay? But God could, in theory, withdraw his unique life if he is specially sharing it with us, leaving us still in existence with a lesser, though still actually spiritual life, even into the eons of the eons. He could do that forever if he chose. Our lives are always derivative of God anyway. And I have less than no problem trusting that God will continue to give his life to those who continue in fellowship with him, just like I have less than no problem noting unfallen angels have to have Eonian life from God, which would include the devil and his angels before they rebelled. So unless we're talking about the actively self-living, self-existent God himself, having Eonian life is not in itself a guarantee of its own continuation. That's only true for God. And maybe Lucifer was expecting that if he had Eonian life, it would be continuing even if he rebelled. I don't know. His psychology is weird. But rather, God gives to creatures Eonian life, or he withdraws it from creatures according to his love and justice. He grafts branches into the vine, and he breaks branches off. And those he grafts in may be cut out, and those born by God's natural decree to the vine may be broken off. But those broken off by God may easily be grafted back in by God, whenever God so deems it proper. Well, what about the fire reserved for the devil and his angels, into which the baby goats will be thrown? Should I conclude it might end, even though I describe it as Eonian? Well, if I only had the scripture to go on, I might conclude, in context of the warning not to conclude otherwise, that the Eonian fire will end, and I would at least strongly suspect I shouldn't regard the punishment of the rebel angels as hopeless, even though, unlike the baby goats, they aren't described as the least of Christ's flock. To argue that they aren't regarded as the least, well, that seems like the lawyer quibbling over who my neighbor is, whom I might not have to love. But as it happens, I don't actually expect the Eonian fire to end, even though I do expect the devil and his angels to be saved by God through Christ from their sins. But to talk about why I don't expect the fire to end and yet to be the best of things for helping bring peace to those it acts upon, I would have to go into the next unexpected testimony text, and that will be next week.
I think I know where you're going with this.
Yeah. But I do want to, before I go on to that, I do want to address some immediate objections. Because next week I'm going to start another huge block of interlinked testimony, and I really feel like before I do that, I ought to address some objections that people might be having. And the most important objection may be this. I've been arguing, especially here, that the people being punished in the parable of the sheep and the baby goats and in the parable of the talents were being punished as enemies of God instead of rewarded as the loyal Christians the details indicate they should have been, because they expected God to hopelessly punish his enemies. Now, if you haven't already stopped watching the video when I said that in a knee-jerk panic, and you're still watching it this far, well, I want you to understand the implications of what I'm saying, but I also want you to understand what I'm not saying. Okay? I don't mean by this that the parables are saying that God punishes people for believing God hopelessly punishes people. Okay, I didn't conclude that, and I really don't mean that. Much less do I conclude that the parables mean God hopelessly punishes people for believing God hopelessly punishes people. A belief that God hopelessly punishes people is only a belief about facts, be it correct or incorrect. It is not in itself a moral failing to be incorrect about whether the logical math adds up validly, or about whether facts are accurate enough and sufficiently numerous enough to draw an accurate conclusion. The moral failing being judged in those parables is uncharity, and even non-universalists recognize that generally. And it's not about the mere fact of a lack of charity. If it was just a mere fact about the lack of charity, the man with the one talent would not have been accepted had he merely put it in the bank to draw interest, because that's like the least charitable thing you can do and still have forward motive.
Yeah, it's about wanting someone to burn.
He wanted someone to burn, baby! He had a consciously insistent attitude of the heart against sinners being saved from their sins. You could put it this way, even though it's a little oversimple. The Son incarnate was given the common name of Joshua, or Jesus. That's one way to transliterate that name into Greek. That's how we've done it in English. But Joshua was a really common name, top 5 common name back then in that area of the world. He was given that name because he would be saving his people from their sins. So if you insistently deny in your heart as a chosen preferential attitude that he will save his people from their sins after all, that is literally the same as denying the name of Jesus, which we are frequently warned against doing in the New Testament, especially by Jesus himself. Now, Calvinistic Christians who emphasize the gospel of assurance in the declaration of the importance of the name, Jesus shall definitely be saving his people from their sins, they could strongly agree with that over against Arminianistic Christians and their older Catholic parallels either way.
Perseverance of the saints!
Perseverance of the saints, that's right. It's really more of the perseverance of God about the saints. Perseverance of the saints is intended as evidence that you are of the elect.
Yeah, R.C. Sproul said that he prefers the term preservation of the saints.
Yeah. Yeah, it's not perseverance of the saints. It's preservation of the saints by God. But it's really not even that so much. It's more like the assurance of God to persevere in saving the saints. He's going to keep at it until he gets it done. He's definitely going to get it done, whoever it is he intends to save.
I always tell people, God don't start nothing he doesn't intend on finishing.
Mm-hmm. He's going to finish it. But now, if we go on, but they'll say, oh yeah, Jesus will save his people from their sins. So then they'll ask, well, who do we disqualify here to count as his people? So God doesn't even intend to save those people from sin at all, only his people. Okay, well, that's similar to the lawyer looking for someone who isn't his neighbor so he can get around the second great commandment. It's the very reverse of a spirit of charity and salvation toward enemies of God. Now, if I set my heart to denying the Lord God saves, or the Lord is salvation, which is what the name Joshua literally means in Hebrew, and I'm going to point out here, for many years, I myself once denied the name of Jesus in this regard, despite being a knowledgeable servant of God. But if I set my heart to denying the Lord is salvation, if I set my heart to denying the Lord God saves, how can I be saved? Well, I can only be saved by the grace of God anyway, over against my own insistence otherwise.
I hope I'm not stealing your thunder by saying when it talks about denying the name of Christ, it's talking about denying a person, not, a label.
True. and there's also an argument to the effect that denying the name of Christ has something to do with the proper name of Jehovah, and
Yeah,
that's
I know.
true too.
I was really into the sacred name thing for a long time.
Yeah,
and I'm also into Hebrew
there are
roots and stuff.
more. There's at least 2 other meanings to denying the name of Christ, but I am arguing this is one of the meanings.
I'm pretty sure just from the way I see God dealing, the type of dude that he is, it's all about the inclination of your heart. It really has nothing to do.
And that's what I'm saying here. It's not just simply accidentally denying the name of Christ. There's an intention in the heart involved, and the intention of the
can't accidentally blaspheme the Holy Spirit.
Right. Yeah. Well, and also, I might be wrong about those people over there, but if I'm insisting that God not save those people over there, then I'm undercutting a belief even in my own salvation. But God is stronger than my beliefs about God's salvation.
You're fixing to get eaten by a fish in the process.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, good Jonah reference. Yeah. See, it's only by the grace of God, even after Jonah gets swallowed by the sea monster there, it's really kind of a dragon. It's basically Leviathan. In other words, it's basically Satan. Even after he's swallowed by what amounts to Satan and gets taken down Olam into the prison of Olam.
Yeah, and the word used in there too is Sheol. He was taken
down to Sheol. Yep. Down to the roots of where in every sense, in every regard, he's where the spirit prison is for rebel spirits.
I'm pretty confident of it. In that narrative, he's dead.
He is dead as a doornail.
And that's a picture of Christ, by the way.
Yeah, that's Christ. He uses it as a picture of Christ. Yeah, and you can't say that he wasn't dead because Christ uses it as that being a picture of him.
As Jonah was in the belly of the whale.
Yeah. Now, I guess you could say typologically. Maybe he wasn't dead, but he represented being dead. Okay, fine. He represented being dead and in hell.
Well, what, did he have scuba gear in
Olam. He was there, Olam.
All right. The thing is, what, he had scuba gear?
Olam turned out to be 3 days. But it was
and that's, you know what? And there's a argument too that being separated from the body, being dead, is the same. There's no limit. There's no necessary correspondence to the time here on Earth to the time there.
Yeah, it might feel like forever.
Mm-hmm. And I think C.S. Lewis. I hate that I keep mentioning him because I sound like a one-trick pony. But I think C.S. Lewis really was trying to get that through in the Chronicles of Narnia when he talked about how different Narnia time was from.
Mm-hmm. Oh, I can give you a much better example than that, and you're going to love it. It's from George MacDonald. George MacDonald actually went this route. Very extensively in one of his sermons. He talks about how we would call it sense deprivation, a sense deprivation punishment, and that you're outside the body and you've got. And he goes into really far detail as to how hellish that would be.
Well, yeah, because it's like all your own mind. I think what
it drives you insane.
I think What Dreams May Come drew a really good picture of this.
Yeah, I will tell you. The first time I read that, though, it was not in George MacDonald. The first time I read it, and it is really, really close, like verbally close to what George MacDonald wrote, I discovered later. The first time I read that was in Tom Clancy.
You're shitting me.
I am not kidding you. It is in The Cardinal of the Kremlin. It's a punishment that the Soviets had figured out, that if you put a person as an interrogation technique and a brainwashing technique, if you put them in this situation, and he spells it out just the same way George MacDonald does, runs them through the same things, and the woman that they're doing it to comes out the other side. She was a spy for the Americans. She comes out the other side ready to be good Soviet loyal citizen. She is so glad to not be dead. She's basically so glad to be out of hell.
Nice.
So yeah, that's where I first read it. And so when I read that in George MacDonald, I was like, wait a minute, really? That is too coincidental. Tom Clancy reads George MacDonald, and then I had to try to figure out whether he was criticizing him or not. But anyway, and now Tom Clancy is dead, and he cannot answer that question for us. I will, but he answers it. Maybe he can answer it more. Maybe he can answer it more better with George MacDonald now than any of us can.
I just get the picture in my head in Soviet Russia. We send you to hell.
Yeah. All right. So, well, if I have a preferential insistence that these other people are not going to be saved, that God cannot or will not save them. That runs directly against the fulfillment of fair togetherness between people, which is not only what the most common Greek term in the Bible means that we translate it in English as righteousness or justice, that's using the term soon or together as a quality emphasis for the term dikai, or moral fairness, and so you have dikaiosune. Fair togetherness between people, positive justice, the fulfillment of active love, that's what God intrinsically, essentially is if Trinitarian theism is true. So, and I talked about that a lot in our first episode, so I don't want to get back really into that there, but I'm bringing it up again because here we are, we're back to that topic again. My point right now, however, is to reassure the audience here. On one hand, I'm not saying the scriptures show God judging against people for merely believing some kind of hopeless punishment or fate of sinners is true. But I do want to make sure that y'all do notice the point here. Those parables at the end of Matthew 25 are very often brought out to convince people that God hopelessly punishes at least some sinners. And for at least 20 years, I thought they meant that too. And I was more than just okay with it. Even though I saw, as C.S. Lewis did, that the sheep meant that we can expect many people who don't even know they were serving Christ to be accepted by Christ after all, so I wasn't overly worried about people whom God clearly was leading to be charitable to other people. They were having fruits of the Spirit. And not in a merely legalistic way, but as accepted attitude of their hearts. Fruits of the Spirit are fruits of the Spirit, even if a person isn't formally Christian yet. By the same token, the other way around, I saw well enough the uncharitable Christians will be surprised to discover they haven't been serving Christ after all, and so would be judged like the worst of the impenitent evildoers. And I still believe that, for more reasons than just the testimony of these parables. But I was shocked to find the attitude of my own heart was very wrong about what I thought until then was a correct belief about facts. My attitude in my belief that God would punish at least some sinners hopelessly, my attitude was like that of the baby goats. My attitude was like that of the guy who has the talent and hides it so that he won't be part of helping save these other people from their sins. So I shouldn't be concluding as a matter of belief about mere facts that even only some of those baby goats, and I didn't realize they were supposed to be baby goats, I shouldn't be concluding that they will be hopelessly punished the way I thought the devil and his angels would be hopelessly punished. And it turns out I shouldn't believe the devil and his angels will be hopelessly punished either. It's the same principles. But much more importantly, I should not have had an attitude of insisting on their final unrighteousness and refusing their salvation from sin. That attitude revealed me to be I was one of the baby goats in the parable. I was the condemned steward of the parable of the talents. Even if I have that attitude of final non-salvation toward the devil and his angels for whom the Eonian Fire is prepared. And that hit me hard. So, you know, if that's hitting some of my audience here hard, I can sympathize. But someone could still have a belief about the fact of hopeless punishment or final non-salvation and not have that hateful attitude in your heart. And if that's you, more power to you. You're a better person than I was. And I don't believe for a moment the parables have a judgment warning against you at all. Not for that, anyway. I mean, they could still be judgment warnings about other issues of uncharity, and maybe those would apply to you. They still might apply to me, for that matter. But only you or I and God know if they do or not. And
I'll tell you what, when I first started seeing apocatastasis as being necessary in my scriptural reading, it really was like a kick to the nuts.
It was pretty bad, yeah. I was.
It calls into question.
Staggered.
It calls into question my entire epistemology, my entire approach to scripture, what I know to be true.
And see, I was barely making any adjustments. All I was doing really was polishing Trinitarian theism, my beliefs in Trinitarian theism, and being more consistent as a Trinitarian theist. I wasn't changing anything, really. And yet, all of a sudden, I was seeing myself in the position of these people who are being judged because of the attitude in my heart. So, you know, there are some people that run into this and they feel everything in their lives is being turned upside down because everything they did is backwards and they're having to learn a whole new way of doing it. I was continuing to do the same things that I always did before. The only problem was that I now saw that they added up differently than I thought, and the problem wasn't just that they added up differently. The problem was my attitude was really, really wrong.
Yeah, it's more about what it revealed about who you are.
Yeah, yeah, which is the point of a lot of the parables, so that fits well too.
And
Thou art the man.
I'm one of the few people, I have no problem admitting that there's a part of me that really wants certain people to burn in hell. And I wish that wasn't a part of me. I think if most people are honest, they'd say that there's a part of them that wants certain people to burn in hell.
Emotionally speaking, I don't want Satan to be saved. I don't want Hitler or these other people to be saved.
Think about a rape victim, you know, or think about someone.
I don't want that rapist to be saved.
Yeah, or someone who's had their father murdered by someone. I mean, they want that person to suffer, and they don't want any reconciliation. And
I don't want reconciliation with it. Not emotionally, but I know better now.
That's why the primary thing, I think the primary label that Christians can go by is ministers of reconciliation.
Like Paul says in 2 Corinthians. And there's a big argument there for universal salvation too, which we'll have to get to much later.
Yeah, I think this is probably a good point. I mean, if you're comfortable with it, we can probably...
I do want to cover a few more little objections before we get to next week's thing.
All right, go ahead.
Yeah, and they're kind of important, I guess. Some of them are more important than others. I'll do a trivial one first here. Are these really supposed to be all the people being judged in the sheep and the goats? Because the nations typically refer to non-Jews. And on the other hand, Jesus is finishing an answer to the question of when the Jews will be punished with the fall of the temple for rejecting Jesus. So are these really all people? Are they actually, is this the judgment of the Gentiles? Is this the judgment of the Jews? Well, yes, they're both. The context, both of the scriptures that Jesus is referencing here, one of them is a judgment of the Jews, and one of them is a judgment of the Gentiles. So actually, yeah, they're actually both. They're not just one or the other. They are actually both. What if it's only a judgment on the devil and the rebel angels? Now that may sound strange. I've actually heard this theory from somewhere before recently. Haven't heard it before, haven't heard it again, but it's kind of interesting. I certainly can't deny the baby goats are being punished the way the devil and his angels are, because that's there on the page. And it's echoed in some other scriptures like Rev. John and Jude and the Petrine epistles. That rather leaves up in the air who the charitable, mature members of the flock are, who didn't even know they were serving Jesus. The comparison of the two kinds of flock members seemed kind of broken, but I suppose they could, in theory, be neutral spirits helping people without being officially on the side of God, perhaps even ignorant of God. Jesus and at least one New Testament author do hint on occasion that there are angels who are not necessarily hostile to us, but who are outside the loop enough, the outside fellowship of God, that they are curious to know what's happening with Jesus and Christians. So, still, my main answer to the theory, which is only an objection by being a different kind of theory, is that the preceding three parables and the Old Testament reference for this parable are all about human servants of Christ being judged. And the warnings are pretty clearly being given to the human servants of Christ right there on the scene. That's the apostles and the other close disciples. So it would be pretty weird for Jesus just to switch over to talking about only the devil and the rebel angels being punished here. Isn't this only the millennium reign judgment, not the final judgment? A non-universalist could try going with this idea, although more often I've seen it coming from universalists who deny God punishes anyone at the lake of fire judgment. Except the Eonian Fire prepared for the devil and his angels does seem to be at least conceptually related to the lake of fire judgment, so it might as well be the lake of fire judgment. Still, you know, it's true that the two references from the Nevi'im, the prophets of the Jewish Tanakh, what we call the Old Testament, don't seem to be talking about a lake of fire judgment exactly, nor is there any obvious general resurrection going on after which people are being judged. There could be, but it isn't said in any of those places, and neither is a judgment about a general resurrection part of the preceding three judgment parables in GosMatt. To be honest, the main reason I regard this parable as talking about a post-resurrection judgment instead of a judgment to start the millennium reign, completely aside of whatever that may mean, is because of the positive mention of the Eonian Fire, and because the details don't really exclude it. Meaning the lake of fire. But I'm okay with the OT prophecies being about a millennium reign judgment of survivors, possibly even judging them to the death in some cases, just like I'm okay with the indications that the reign will be a massively successful, though not entirely successful, evangelical effort, at least for a while. The judgments of God have the same overall goal and result in view, and as long as that overall goal and result is kept in view, which is what we talked about last week, I'm okay with multiple similar but different judgments. Well, you know, someone could then say, well, God raises those who aren't honoring the Father and the Son to a resurrection of judgment. My first answer is that the details of the sheep and the goat judgment indicate I had better not regard that punishment as hopeless. And my second answer is that this is why I started with talking about John 5 and a bunch of its related contexts last week. I haven't imported those conclusions here, but anyone who remembers them should be able to see how they fit together. But as I said, I'd rather make the case for Matt 25 and its context on their own merits, and that's what I've done. So, now, some people might say, I object because I believe some sinners are finally annihilated, not consciously tormented forever. Well, you know, it's still a hopeless punishment. It still ends in final unrighteousness and no salvation from sin. The principle of insisting upon a hopeless punishment and final unrighteousness of sinners is the same either way, which is why I haven't really talked about distinguishing between them up to this point. Debating over which kind of final non-salvation is intended in those parables is wrong either way. Though obviously, if I conclude the punishment is hopeful, or to be precise, if I conclude I ought not to conclude the punishment is hopeless, to that extent I have to infer the parable runs against final annihilation, not in favor of it. All right, someone might object. I'm not. They might look at me and say, "Well, but you're not arguing these parables are positive testimony in favor of universal salvation." That's true. I'm not actually arguing they are positive evidence in favor of universal salvation. I'm only arguing they point toward that interpretation and away from hopeless punishment. So I'm not arguing for an agnostic result, but I'm also trying to be fair and not press the conclusion here beyond what the evidence can bear. See, I'm not arguing that these parables testify both to the scope of God's intention to save all sinners from sin, and also to the victorious persistence of God's salvation of sinners from sin. I doubt these parables count as specific evidence for either of those, and much less for both. But if I find strong evidence for both elsewhere, that certainly is not going to hurt a conclusion here that I shouldn't have an intentional attitude in my heart against the salvation of sinners from sin. And so I shouldn't interpret these or any other parables the way the anti-evangelical servant or the baby goats would. Now, someone could go on to say, well, that still means someone could interpret these and other parables and scriptural data in favor of final perdition. Well, yeah, so far as I've gone up to this point, yes, that's technically still possible. I don't know how feasibly possible it would be to do that once the interpreter has seen the points behind the consideration and the condemnation of the baby goats and the lazy servant, but I'm willing to be charitable about that. The problem would be the attitude about finally hopeless punishment. Someone could theoretically argue we shouldn't have a hateful attitude about it, and yet it's going to happen. Someone could argue, but we shouldn't be getting our theology from parables anyway. Well, you know what? I sympathize with that complaint, and if anyone wants to make it, they're free to skip over every time I talk about parables, and man, you probably aren't even, you probably stopped listening to this 2 hours or 3 hours ago.
So, hey, we've had people come in and out as far as viewers, but we still have one viewer, and Johnny's still on, so it's interesting stuff.
Yeah, well, you know, but now, if you're going to call in this objection, you shouldn't turn around later and call back to the parables and prophecies in favor of hopeless punishment either. So, some objectors may say,
I would just go in there that Jesus thought pretty highly of parables, since that was mostly how he communicated to people.
Right, so, you know, you can't just throw away the parables.
Exactly.
He's teaching something with them every time. You know, you've got to try to figure out what it is if you're going to try to understand Jesus.
Yeah, and ECTs they absolutely love the rich man and Lazarus. So.
Yeah, which is a parable. So, you know, yeah. But now I realize there are people that don't think we should be trying to get specific doctrines out of parables. Okay.
Did you just say doctrinal doctrine?
Yeah, you know, getting really picky doctrines out of parables because they are so kind of loose, and you know, they're you can. It'd be like saying, well, the parable of the prodigal son doesn't talk anything about Christology, and therefore you shouldn't be trying to get Christology out of the parable of the prodigal son. That's true.
You know, that only works if you want to eliminate transcendence from the equation.
Well, it only works if you're not willing to put all the pieces together later. Just because something doesn't talk about a doctrine someplace, that doesn't mean it's not someplace else.
Right, so, I agree with you. The reason why I mentioned transcendence is because I believe that's the reason why the Bible is so allegorical in so many respects, just because it's talking about a truth that's outside of our frame of reference.
A metaphor, like I talked about a couple of episodes ago, a metaphor is usually means more than what the word itself means.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, sometimes it means less. Sometimes we use a metaphor to mean less than the word itself means, but usually it means more. So, I know a lot of people actually. I've run across people who do this. James Harding, for one. They don't believe God punishes people after death, or maybe ever. Sinners punish themselves, or God just lets them abuse themselves forever, or maybe lets them annihilate themselves. The door to hell is locked from the inside, and so they're going to object to my arguments here on that ground. Well, I have some major theological problems with that position, and I talked about that a couple of episodes ago, but here, let me say, no one who takes this kind of increasingly popular position, which tries to avoid God inflicting a hopelessly final punishment on at least some sinners while still affirming some kind of hopelessly final fate for them. Once you take that, you should never accuse me or any other Christian Universalist, or non-Christian Universalist for that matter, of ignoring and or explaining away giant swatches of scriptural testimony for our own convenience. Because the Judeo-Christian scriptures, including these key examples, are positively thunderous about showing God personally acting to punish sinners, especially in the eschaton, the final judgment. And they're also showing God stridently insisting on being personally and authoritatively responsible for sending other persons, often they're usually sinners themselves, to go hammer punitively on sinners. So if you want to ignore or discount that evidence, fine. You can just skip whenever I talk about the scriptures affirming God's positive authoritative action in punishing the unjust. Just keep in mind, I'm the one who's keeping a fuller account of the scriptural evidence, at least on this topic. So don't charge me or others like me for not doing so. And I have to sharply write about this because I see non-universalists denying God punishes anyone after death or maybe even before death, and yet they will turn around almost in the same breath and accuse us of conveniently ignoring or reinterpreting obvious scriptural evidence in favor of our beliefs. I'm just saying, be fair. And I will also add, good luck trying to get those 3 parables in Matthew 25, or the 4th one going back to Matthew 24, to be about sinners going their own way apart from God, while he merely looks on regretfully or in disdain, but takes no authoritative punitive action against them. The closest match to that is the parable of the foolish virgins, I guess, and man, they do not end up locking themselves inside hell while the bridegroom's knocking outside. Now, I realize no one better. My beloved and honored teacher, C.S. Lewis, strongly promoted this idea. Sometimes. Sometimes he strongly promoted the idea instead that God actively punishes impenitent sinners, including after death. And he also strongly taught sometimes in the same book that he taught that we should expect God to know when to finally give up, namely the problem of pain. He also taught in that same book we should never expect God to finally give up trying to lead sinners out of sin and into righteousness. Nor should we expect the great chess player to be outplayed by sinners and so lose the match. He was not very consistent on this topic.
What would you say of his quote when he said that heaven will not be held captive, the joy of heaven will not be held captive to the suffering of hell?
Yeah, that's in Great Divorce.
Yeah.
Well, of course it's not going to be held captive to the suffering of hell, but heaven is going to go in and get them.
That's just a shout out. That's just a shout out to Justin Fowler because he had a problem with that quote.
Heaven is not going to be ignored by hell. And even as much as hell wants to ignore heaven. And that's kind of at the end of the Great Divorce, too. Here comes the sunlight falling on like bricks. Yeah.
I was just thinking of the coming dawn, the rumors of what's coming.
Dawn is on the way.
That of which they will not speak.
Mm-hmm. All right, let's see. Other objections. Well, I've heard some people say God does not force people to freely accept him. He doesn't spiritually rape people. He only woos. Okay, well, I'm a Louisiana Christian. I respect the respect for created free wills that lies behind this objection, and there are some Christian Universalists who are very much deterministic and not at all in favor of free will. And then we're really talking about the capability to do X, and this is getting back into some things that we talked in previous issues here, previous episodes. I understand and accept it would be strictly contradictory to say God forces people to freely act morally good. That's in fact why I have no problem metaphysically affirming people may actively continuing fondling their sins impenitently into the eons of the eons. But without going back into all the metaphysical logic and stuff, let me just for now observe these parables and other scriptural testimony we'll be getting to along the way do not even slightly show some kind of sensitive concern for inconveniencing the free will of sinners. After all, sinners naturally prefer to keep acting unjustly without suffering inconveniences for doing so. Sinners are not free to be free from God authoritatively acting to judge them, much less from God authoritatively forcing effects of that judgment upon them. Sinners may freely refuse to value and honor the justice of God, wholly ruining them, but they are not free to avoid being wholly ruined by God. And by the same token, if God's respect and regard for the free will he has created and sustains in creatures should be appealed to, and I agree it should, we must not interpret these judgments to mean the punished sinners are not free to repent and come to justice. See, the hidden test of the judgment parables bites you in the butt again. If you insist in various ways the punishments result in those being punished no longer being free to act justly with God instead of unjustly against God, you're revealing yourself to be under the judgment with them. At any rate, it's the height of self-contradiction to try to claim that God respects the free will of sinners so much he either permanently shuts down their free will one way or another, perhaps by annihilating them out of existence, or he allows them to destroy their own free will to do good instead of evil somehow, despite them getting the supernatural ability from nowhere other than from God, the Father of the spirits. So, as much as I believe God positively values and establishes and cherishes creaturely freedom of the will, even when the creatures abuse this freedom of the will to do injustice instead of justice, that does not stop God from actively punishing impenitent sinners. And if you want
how much free will did the Valley of Dry Bones have?
Yeah, they didn't have any free will to be raised, did they? You didn't have the free will to stop God coming and saving you.
And how much free will did Lazarus have for being raised from the dead?
Right. No one complains about free will when they're praising God for saving them. They're only complaining about free will when they want to be free to be evil forever.
And I'm convinced it's because they don't understand just how desperately lost they are. That's why I think a proper doctrine of depravity is really necessary in these things. And anyone who has children, realistically, and sees them, knows what depravity is all about.
Yeah, this is true. So, if you want to call God punishing sinners the same as God raping sinners, I guess that's your choice, I suppose. But if you do, be fair and admit I'm the one affirming more scriptural details here. Even that God throws people to the tormentors, which is more literally to the torturers, in the unquenchable fire of Gehenna, which is going to lead into next week.
And I think it bears mentioning that if people are going to be swearing allegiance to God, if they're going to be willingly do so, then the compulsion is such that their will is willingly changed.
I think what God is compulsing exactly here, he's changing the environment, which is going to result in our ability to deal with the environment.
Well, right. When we have this skin suit on, there's all kinds of ways to escape the consequences of our twisted heart. But when we have nothing but us, like you were talking earlier, the sensory deprivation, and not just nothing but us, but we have the perfection that is consuming us all around us, bearable to resist it. But once we give into it, it's not as though, oh, take me. No, it's like, oh, wow, wait, this is really cool. Please, yes, take me.
Yeah. I mean, God's giving you Eonian life. That's the judgment. That's what we talked about last week. The judgment actually is God giving Eonian life to everything that's His, even those things that are rejecting the Eonian life. He's still giving it to them. And they're rejecting it.
And this speaks right to privatio boni, the lack of good being the essence of evil, and how people get this substance idea in their heads where it's like there's some substance that's lacking. It's like, no, everything's still there. It's just not arranged properly. And when it's properly arranged, when it's properly aligned with God Himself, it's a beautiful resonance that takes place.
Yeah. So, we're going to get now into next week. We're going to talk about Gehenna. And you know what? God is not just letting people wander off to Gehenna while He sadly hangs back and sighs. That's not what's happening. That's not what Jesus says is happening.
Did you watch the show where Gary Amirault was on?
I did not watch the show with Gary Amirault on.
Before next week, you need to watch that show.
Okay.
because we talked a lot about that very subject, and there was a lot of textual things, a lot of Greek things that were brought out into it, and it's super, super relevant.
Okay. Yeah, I'm here. All right. We'll get to it next week. It is 8:15. It's time for me to go to bed.
All right, man. I really appreciate the whole conversation. I think you gave a great lecture. I think that there's a lot of really. It's so funny how subtle the things that you revealed are. It's just these little tiny details that are intrinsic to the language, intrinsic to the wording of things, that
And the
just
cultural context, yeah.
Yeah, that slight little adjustment, and it changes everything. It changes the whole perspective.
I'm not going to talk about this later because it doesn't really have anything to do with saving people from their sins. But in Mark, Matthew, and John, each of them has a version of the scene where Jesus is walking on the water. Okay, you have the. Well, if you put all of those together, you discover something really interesting that none of them by themselves shows. Jesus is not going out there to rescue them. He's walking past them.
Yes, I have noticed that before, and it's only when they start crying out to him that he pays them any attention.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, he knows they're there. He can see them on the lake. It says that he can see them out there on the lake because the moon.
That's not the whole point. The whole point is he just wanted to get to the shore. He's like, screw you guys.
He was kind of moving secretly. He was like, he didn't. It was like kind of like he didn't even really intend for them to see him walking on the lake.
Well, the last time, he
was just going to surprise them by being there when they got there.
I think this is one of his. He got to the point where he was like, "Come on, Holy Spirit, just give me a way to get away from these yahoos."
Oh yeah. Well, he was trying to get away from. He was trying to get away from the people who were crowning him king, who wanted to crown him king.
Yes.
And he told the guy. He told the disciples. He said, "Okay, get the boat and meet me in Bethesda, and I'll get there, Bethsaida, and I'll be there later tonight." Only he didn't tell them exactly which Bethsaida. And they were up near the north of the lake, where that's where Bethsaida Julius was. Okay, there's another Bethsaida. That's the one near Capernaum. And so they had probably waited there until the middle of the night, and he was up still on the hills praying. And so they were like, well, maybe we went to the wrong Bethsaida. So now they're rowing across the lake to the Capernaum Bethsaida. Bethsaida is a fisherton, basically. It means fisher town. It's like a little suburb. So probably the one that was Bethsaida Julius, which was named after the Emperor Julia.
Yeah.
Empress
Julia. The last thing I'll mention about that particular narrative is that the little research I've done into the construction of the passage really firmly indicates that this storm that cropped up out of nowhere was supernatural in origin.
Oh, really? Oh, okay.
Yeah. I can try to dig a little and find some references for you later.
I never noticed anything that indicated that was important. Not like the tornado that Jesus shotguns on the lake at a different time.
Right.
They're not in danger exactly. They're just having a hard time rowing against it.
Well, they were saying that they were dying.
Yeah, they were saying that.
Well,
he was walking by them.
You got to think these are. I think it's strongly indicated just because these are very seasoned fishermen. They've been doing this their whole lives. This is nothing new to them. And all of a sudden, the storm comes up out of nowhere, and it's like I really do think that they were in fear for their lives. But anyway,
and I gotta draw to walk by them.
Yeah. He's like, screw you guys. But yeah, I gotta draw this to a close.
Okay, we gotta go.
Yeah, it's been a great conversation.
Thanks for having me.
I want to mention a couple of things, or you can sign off if you want.
I'm going to sign off because I've got to set things off and head for bed. But you
all right.
Go. Okay, bye bye.
Right. You have a good night. Boom, 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 boom. There he goes. There goes Jason. Jason goes. This is his outro. There goes Jason. Jason Pratt, the Universalist. So, Johnny, I don't know if you can hear me or if you can respond or anything, but if there's anything you want to mention before I finally sign off, now's the time. But yeah, in closing, that was a really, really great conversation, and I think this was the most significant one in the series. This was the third one. And I think we really went to the heart. I mean, the first one, I think was primarily philosophical. The second one took us more into the flow of Scripture. The third one is where we're really zeroing in on the key passages and the key themes that are really the exegetical heart of why we feel so firmly that all people will eventually be saved. Fancy Greek theological term is apokatastasis. I know other people will say it differently, but I grew up reading Marvel comics, and that just sounds like a great name for a villain. So, apokatastasis. That's what it's all about. And I really feel, I just, when you look at it through this exegetical lens that puts you in the proper context, we're not stretching here. We're not doing any mental gymnastics. We're just trying to read the text for what it says in the terminology with the intent of people from that era. You know, extrapolating meaning from usage from both biblical and secular sources, because the language isn't religious in nature. You know, I mean, like we were talking about the usage of ion and ionios and ionion outside of Scripture being a lot in Plato's work, talking about the eternal. And his concept of the eternal, for the non-initiate.
I'm going to say Ionios.
Ionios, the band. Yes, his band is Ionios. Johnny's band is Ionios. And they are awesome, by the way. So definitely look that up on Facebook and like that page. Aionios, I believe.
Incorrect.
Oh, screw you. Whatever. Spell it.
Aionios.
Dude, that's the end of the night. Whatever. So, yeah, and I just want to make a quick mention too that the Wandering Pilgrims does have a fan page. We'd very much appreciate your likes, and if you want to get updates and notifications and stuff, make sure you click Get Notifications. And we also have the group that you're more than welcome to join. Anyone out there, the Facebook group, the Wandering Pilgrims, where we discuss things related to the show and sometimes random things. And if you have suggestions, or maybe if you want to even be involved, you can hop into that group. We approve all members, and as long as you're civil, we're cool. And so, yeah, I guess I don't really know what else to say tonight other than I can't wait for next week to get into some of those other passages, because Gehenna, which is most often translated hell, is, to me, probably the one thing that, like, that interpretation of the word Gehenna, I think, is the one thing in Scripture that really makes people kind of firm on it. I mean, I know tonight we talked about Matthew 25 and how that's the go-to passage because it seems so cut and dry, and as we found out, it is cut and dry, but in a very different way. But those four passages that talk about Gehenna, I think there's a more psychological element there that you hear a thing enough times. I mean, you see it 4 different times in 3 synoptic gospels, so that's 12 times in all. You're hearing this repetition, and it gets it in your head that, you know, he's talking about a place of eternal torment. And I myself, I hope anyone who hasn't seen the Gary Amaralt show should really check that out. We had him as a special guest on a couple of months ago. We talked a lot about that, and I think there's a lot there, and I'm sure that we'll talk a lot about that next week with Jason. So for all of our faithful followers, thank you for joining us tonight. It's been a privilege and an honor to be able to present these things. I'm sure that everyone on here would admit that none of us think that we're always right, and we're just trying to figure stuff out. Me. What's that?
Except for me.
Except for you, yes. Johnny's always right. But we really do appreciate.
Hey, the beard's always right.
The beard's always right. Mm-hmm. Did you get a haircut today?
No.
Okay. So, all right. I'm going to go off air. So, thank you guys for joining us. We are the Wandering Pilgrims. All of your theology belongs to us. Good night, guys. See you next week. Soft broadcast.